Welcome to Dark History, the channel where shadows of the past rise again. Tonight, we enter one of the most scandalous and feared stories of the Renaissance. A family whose very name became a symbol of corruption, ambition, and forbidden power. The Borgias, Rome, the late 15th century. A city of cathedrals and blood, of sacred prayers and whispered conspiracies. Behind the walls of the Vatican, the papal throne was not only a seat of faith, but a crown of absolute power, and one man, Rodrigo Borgia, would stop at nothing to claim it. He bribed, he manipulated, he seduced, and when he rose as Pope Alexander VI, the church itself became his family's empire. His son, Cesare, was the sword of the Borgias, ruthless, brilliant, and merciless. His daughter Lucretia became a legend of beauty, scandal, and whispered sins. Together, they ruled with charm, terror, and ambition unlike anything Rome had ever seen. But power built on corruption cannot last forever. Enemies circled, rumors grew, and the shadow of the Borgias spread across Europe, darker with every secret, every betrayal, every mysterious death. This is not just a story of popes and princes. It is the story of power without limits, of a dynasty that played God, and of a family whose name would echo through history as both rulers and monsters. Subscribe to Dark History, and hit the bell icon to never miss the stories the world tried to bury. Tonight, the truth of the Borgias will be revealed. Chapter 1. The Serpent in Rome. The city of Rome, in the late 15th century, was not the Rome of emperors, nor the Rome of marble triumphs that once ruled the known world. This was a Rome cracked and faded, its ancient stones buried beneath centuries of decay, its glory a shadow of its former self. But if the Roman Empire had crumbled, Rome had found another empire, one not of armies and legions, but of bishops and priests, of relics and rituals. Rome had become the heart of Christendom, the throne of St. Peter, the center of the Catholic Church, and in those twisting alleys, where beggars clutched rosaries as tightly as their hunger, and cardinals schemed in candlelit palaces, a new kind of empire was being forged, one of faith and corruption, holiness and sin, salvation and damnation. It is here, in this fragile and fractured city, that a name whispered in both awe and disgust would rise to dominate the course of history: Borgia. The Borgias were not Roman, they were not Italian, not of the ancient noble families of Florence or Venice, not heirs to Caesar's blood or Charlemagne's crown. They came from Spain, from the dusty lands of Valencia, where ambition often burned hotter than the Mediterranean sun. And that ambition had a face: Rodrigo Borgia. Rodrigo was no ordinary man of faith. He had entered the church not as a holy calling, but as a ladder to power, influence, and wealth. From his earliest days, he learned that in Rome, holiness was a mask, and behind it was the raw machinery of politics. With charm like velvet and a will of iron, Rodrigo knew how to win allies, silence rivals, and play the endless game of power that was the papacy. He would not be remembered as a humble servant of Christ, but as a man who used the papal throne as a weapon, turning faith into a battlefield. But to understand Rodrigo's rise, one must first understand the Rome of his time. By the 15th century, the papacy had been scarred by centuries of division. The Great Schism had torn Christianity in two, with rival popes seated in both Rome and Avignon. Corruption festered at every level of the church. Bishops bought their offices with gold, indulgences were sold like merchandise, and the coffers of cardinals overflowed, while peasants starved in the countryside. Rome itself was not just the capital of Christendom, but the capital of hypocrisy. And yet, in that hypocrisy, there was opportunity. Rodrigo Borgia understood this better than anyone. His uncle, Alfonso Borgia, had risen from obscurity to become Pope Calixtus III. Through that connection, Rodrigo had been brought into the Sacred College of Cardinals at the young age of 25, handsome, eloquent, and ruthless when needed. Rodrigo quickly became known for his charm and his appetites. He was a cardinal, but he was also a man of flesh. Whispers spread through Rome of his many mistresses, his lavish banquets, his children born in the shadows of his holy office. But Rodrigo did not hide them, he flaunted them. For him, scandal was not a weakness, it was proof of power. Among his children were names that history would never forget: Cesar Borgia, Lucrezia Borgia, Juan Borgia. They would be pawns and players in Rodrigo's grand game, living embodiments of a papacy where family came before faith. Rodrigo's ambition was simple. He wanted the papal throne, and in 1492, the opportunity came. The death of Pope Innocent VIII left the chair of St. Peter vacant. The conclave of cardinals, that most sacred ritual, was not a matter of prayer, but of politics. The cardinals gathered, not to ask the guidance of the Holy Spirit, but to count the weight of gold, to measure the promises of favors, to strike deals in whispered corners. Rodrigo came armed with both charm and fortune. He bribed cardinals with lands, titles, and riches. He promised bishoprics to their nephews, castles to their brothers, honors to their cousins. It was a marketplace, and Rodrigo was the best merchant of them all. On August 11th, 1492, Rodrigo Borgia was crowned as Pope Alexander VI. The streets of Rome erupted in celebration, but beneath the fireworks and the ringing of church bells, a darker reality took shape. Rome had a new shepherd, but he was a shepherd who saw his flock as a kingdom to be ruled, a dynasty to be founded, a legacy to be carved in blood and stone. From the moment he donned the papal tiara, Alexander VI set to work securing his family's power. His children, though illegitimate, would be legitimized through marriage and appointment. Cesar, brilliant and ruthless, would be steered toward the cardinalate, though his true hunger was for the sword. Juan, reckless and arrogant, would be raised as Alexander's favored heir. Lucretia, young and beautiful, would be the pawn in a game of alliances, her hand in marriage sold to the highest bidder. But Rodrigo's Rome was not secure. The papal states were surrounded by ambitious powers: France, Spain, Venice, Milan, the Holy Roman Empire. Italy was a chessboard of shifting alliances, and Alexander knew he could not sit idly as pope. He would play the game as no pope had before, using not only the weapons of faith, but the weapons of war. As Alexander VI rose higher, so too did the whispers of his corruption. His enemies accused him of simony, of selling holy offices like merchants sold grain. They accused him of poisoning rivals, of keeping a harem within the Vatican, of turning the holiest institution in Christendom into a Borgia kingdom. And though many of the accusations were exaggerated, there was always a kernel of truth. For Alexander, power justified every act. Yet, it was not simply corruption that made the Borgias feared. It was their vision. Cesar Borgia, Alexander's most formidable son, was unlike any man of his age: cold, calculating, and ambitious. Cesar would one day abandon the robes of a cardinal to become a general, carving out a dominion in Italy through war and terror. He was the blade of the Borgia family, the executioner of his father's will. Where Alexander schemed, Cesare struck, and in his rise, some would see the foreshadowing of a new kind of leader, the modern prince, whose power lay not in divine right, but in sheer force of will. Niccolò Machiavelli himself would watch Cesare closely, later using him as the model for the prince. And then there was Lucretia. To her enemies, she was a temptress, a poisoner, a woman of incest and scandal. To others, she was a pawn, forced into marriages and alliances by her father's ruthless hand. The truth of Lucretia's life lies somewhere between legend and reality, but what is certain is that she became one of the most controversial women in Renaissance history, her name forever entwined with whispers of poison rings and forbidden love. But in 1492, all of that still lay in the future. For now, the Borgias were at the beginning of their reign, and Rome was both their stage and their prey. Picture the Vatican in those days, vast halls lit by flickering torches, frescoes of saints staring down from the ceilings, and in the midst of it all, Pope Alexander VI in his golden robes, his eyes not on heaven but on the map of Italy spread before him. Every bishopric, every duchy, every kingdom was a piece to be moved, a prize to be won. The papacy was no longer a spiritual office. Under Alexander, it was a dynasty. Yet, every rise invites enemies. Even as Alexander secured his throne, the rival families of Italy, the Orsini, the Colonna, the Sforza plotted his downfall. Kings and princes across Europe watched with suspicion. The Pope was meant to be the father of Christendom. But in Alexander, they saw a serpent in holy robes, a man whose ambition could shake the very foundations of Europe. And so, as the bells of Rome rang out for Alexander VI's coronation, another sound echoed in the shadows, the sharpening of knives. The Borgias had risen, but their story was not one of peace. It was a story of betrayal, of blood, of power grasped at any cost. And as Chapter 1 closes, the question remains, how far would the Borgias go to keep their throne? Chapter 2. The throne of St. Peter. The year was 1492, and Rome, like much of Italy, was a city both dazzling and diseased. Its marble streets carried the echoes of the Caesars, but its heart throbbed with corruption, ambition, and blood. Cardinals and noble families maneuvered in the shadows, jockeying for power like gladiators in an unseen arena. This was not the Rome of saints and martyrs, it was the Rome of gold, poison, and whispered sins. In that year, the papal throne, the throne of St. Peter itself, would become the most coveted prize in Christendom. And Rodrigo Borgia, infamous for his cunning charm and scandalous appetites, would seize it in a way that would forever taint the papacy with his name. The papal election of 1492 began under a veil of intrigue. Innocent VIII had died after a reign riddled with weakness and compromise, and with his death, the conclave of cardinals gathered in Rome to choose his successor. They were not just priests, they were princes of a vast spiritual empire, lords of wealth and armies, men whose votes could be swayed by fear, loyalty, or the weight of gold. Rodrigo Borgia, the Cardinal of Valencia, was already one of the most powerful men in the Curia. He had amassed wealth beyond imagination, controlled benefices, and surrounded himself with loyal supporters. But ambition burned hotter within him than piety ever had. He wanted the papacy, and he would stop at nothing to grasp it. The corridors of the Vatican swirled with rumors, chests of gold moving in the dead of night, promises of lucrative positions whispered in candlelit rooms, and alliances forged over feasts drenched in wine. It was said that no cardinal went untouched by Rodrigo's hand, either through bribes, favors, or threats. Some were gifted villas, others bishops. The powerful Orsini and Colonna families, long at odds, suddenly found common cause when Rodrigo's offers filled their coffers. What should have been a sacred ritual of divine guidance became, under Borgia's orchestration, an auction for the most powerful office in the world, and Rodrigo knew exactly how to win. But it wasn't only gold that paved his path, it was charisma. Borgia possessed a magnetic presence. His deep voice, his calculated gestures, and his aura of authority could sway even the most reluctant. He understood people's weaknesses and desires, and he spoke to them not as lofty ideals, but as flesh and blood cravings. To some he promised security, to others revenge, and to many, simple riches. The cardinals, weary of conflict and dazzled by his offers, began to tilt in his favor. Yet beneath their smiles lay suspicion. They knew Rodrigo Borgia was not a man of holiness, but of appetite, not a shepherd of souls, but a master of intrigue. And still, they chose him. On August 11, 1492, the deal was sealed. Rodrigo Borgia emerged from the conclave as Pope Alexander VI. The city erupted into celebrations, and for a moment, Rome seemed united in joy. Fireworks lit the night, the streets thronged with processions, and wine flowed like rivers. But beneath the jubilation, the whispers grew louder. The papacy has been bought. For those who had long feared the corruption of the church, Rodrigo's election was the final confirmation that the sacred had been sold to the profane. The new pope was already infamous for his mistresses and children scandals that had no place in the papal household. Yet now he sat on the throne of St. Peter, cloaked not in sanctity, but in shadows. From the very beginning, Alexander VI revealed what kind of pontiff he would be. His coronation was not an act of humble devotion, but a spectacle of wealth and splendor. Jewels glittered, tapestries hung heavy with gold, and the processional routes through Rome were transformed into theaters of magnificence. To the poor, it was a dazzling vision of divine favor. To the powerful, it was a statement. The Borgias had arrived, and Rome was theirs. But lurking behind the spectacle was a darker truth. Alexander's coronation was also the crowning of his family, for he did not ascend to the papacy as a lone figure of faith, but as the patriarch of a dynasty. His children would rise with him, and his papal office would become their weapon. Cesare Borgia, Rodrigo's brilliant and ambitious son, was immediately elevated in status, showered with church titles and responsibilities. Though he had little interest in the priesthood, Cesare played the role demanded of him, all the while plotting for the day he could cast off the robes of a cardinal and don the armor of a soldier. Juan Borgia, another son, was favored openly by Alexander, who lavished upon him military commands and honors, earning the jealousy of his siblings. And then there was Lucretia, beautiful, and destined to be married off as a pawn in her father's ruthless game of alliances. To Alexander VI, the papacy was no longer about saving souls. It was about securing power, land, and legacy for the Borgias. Not everyone accepted this transformation quietly. Rome's noble families, especially the Orsini and Colonna, watched with alarm as the Borgias entrenched themselves. The Sforza of Milan and the Medici of Florence viewed Alexander's rise with suspicion. Kings and princes across Europe sent envoys to measure him, to test whether he would be an ally or an enemy. And within the College of Cardinals itself, resentment smoldered. Many who had taken his gold now whispered of his corruption, fearing they had unleashed a force more dangerous than they imagined. For the papacy under Alexander VI would not be a reign of peace, but a theater of conspiracies, where every alliance was temporary, and every friend could become an enemy overnight. In his first months, Alexander proved he was more than a schemer. He was a master tactician. He balanced the competing powers of Italy with skill, playing one against the other while always strengthening his own position. He tightened his grip on Rome, surrounding himself with loyal guards and loyal cardinals. He poured wealth into fortifications, ensuring that the Vatican itself could withstand siege or revolt. At the same time, he cultivated an image of grandeur and authority, hosting elaborate feasts, sponsoring artists, and turning Rome into a stage where the Borgias always stood at the center. His reign was a performance, dazzling and terrifying all at once. But the cost of power was blood. Almost immediately, rivals began to die under mysterious circumstances. Poison became a word forever linked with the Borgias, whether true or not. Some claimed Alexander kept a vial of cantarella, a deadly poison, always at hand, administered in fine wine at his banquets. Enemies who dined with him often failed to leave alive. Others argued these were inventions by his enemies, propaganda designed to blacken his name. Yet, in Rome, perception mattered as much as truth, and the perception was this. Alexander VI was a man who would stop at nothing to protect himself and his family. The papacy of Alexander VI was not a reign of quiet devotion, it was a storm. Rome, already a city of sin, became a chessboard where every move was deadly. Cardinals plotted in shadowed corridors, nobles armed themselves, and armies marched at the Pope's command. Through it all, Alexander ruled with a smile, and an iron will, cloaked in the trappings of holiness, but driven by earthly hunger. He was not the vicar of Christ, many said, but the vicar of the Borgias, yet no one could deny his brilliance. In seizing the throne of St. Peter, Rodrigo Borgia had not only changed his own fate, he had reshaped the destiny of Rome itself, and as the smoke from the coronation, feasts faded into the night sky, one truth became undeniable: the Church was no longer the shepherd of souls. Under Alexander VI, it had become a weapon of power, wielded not by saints, but by sinners. Rome had crowned not a pope, but a dynasty, and in the shadows of the Vatican, the first cracks of treachery and betrayal already began to spread. For the Borgias had claimed the throne, but could they hold it? Chapter 3. A family crowned the Vatican had never seen anything like it before. A pope who treated the throne of St. Peter not as a sacred trust, but as the seat of a dynasty. Alexander VI had been crowned with jewels and thunderous processions, but beneath the golden mitre lay a father's ambition. For Rodrigo Borgia was no longer just the vicar of Christ, he was the patriarch of a rising empire, and his children were his true crown. In the marble halls of the apostolic palace, new names echoed with growing weight: Cesar, Juan, Lucretia, and Joffer. They were not hidden away in shame, as the illegitimate offspring of priests were often forced to be. No, Alexander paraded them openly, gifting them wealth, honors, and power. To him, they were not a scandal, but an extension of his will. Rome whispered. Some were shocked, others horrified, but many watched with fascination, for these children were not ordinary bastards. They were the future rulers of Italy, groomed in the heart of Christendom itself. Cesare Borgia, the cardinal-in-waiting, the first and brightest, was Cesare Borgia, Alexander's second son, only 17 when his father ascended the papacy. Cesar was handsome, brilliant, and ambitious beyond measure. His dark eyes burned with the same hunger as Rodrigo's, but unlike his father, Cesar had no patience for the robes of the church. Yet, Alexander had plans. The safest way to secure his dynasty was through ecclesiastical power, and Cesar was destined, at least on paper, to rise as a cardinal. Within weeks of his coronation, Alexander appointed Cesare as the Archbishop of Valencia, a staggering honor for one so young. Soon after, he was elevated to cardinal, cloaked in scarlet robes that disguised the restless soldier within. Cesare smiled at the titles, bowed at the ceremonies, but in his heart he despised the cassock. He longed for steel, for horses, for battlefields drenched in glory. Still, he played the role his father required, at least for now. Caesar's presence in Rome was magnetic. Envoys from France, Spain, and Naples all noted his intelligence and charm. Yet behind that charm was a coldness, a ruthless calculation that would one day terrify Italy. Even as a teenager, Cesar was already being whispered about as dangerous. For while Alexander had crowned him with churchly power, Cesare dreamed of crowns forged in blood. Juan Borgia, the golden son, but Alexander had another favorite, Juan Borgia, his third son. Where Cesar embodied intellect and steel, Juan embodied pleasure and entitlement. He was brash, reckless, and adored by his father. Alexander openly declared him his favorite. To the irritation of his other children and the fury of Rome's nobles, Juan was showered with wealth and titles. He was named Duke of Gandia in Spain, granted command of papal armies, and treated as if the world itself would one day bow to him. Yet he lacked Caesar's cunning or discipline. He was a soldier in title, but not in spirit, a young man more interested in banquets and lovers than in the art of war. Still, Alexander's favor was absolute. To him, Juan was the shining star, the son who would carry the Borgia name across Europe. The favoritism poisoned the family. Cesar, brilliant and capable, was forced into the robes he hated, while Juan, indulgent and careless, was given the honors Cesar believed were rightfully his. Resentment festered. behind the gilded facades of the Vatican, a rivalry began to take root, one that would eventually end in tragedy. Lucretia Borgia, the pawn of power, and then there was Lucretia, Alexander's beloved daughter. Unlike her brothers, she wielded no armies and held no offices, but she was perhaps the most valuable of them all, for in Italy, marriage was as powerful a weapon as any sword. Lucretia was young, barely 12, when her father became pope, but she was already known for her beauty and charm. Alexander saw in her a living alliance. She would be married, not for love, but for strategy. Her hand would bind the Borgias to Italy's mightiest families, ensuring loyalty through blood. Yet Lucretia was no passive pawn. Even as a girl, she possessed intelligence and grace, a softness that disguised a steel core. In the years to come, she would be praised as a hostess of refinement, feared as a schemer, and accused often falsely of sins too dark to name. But in these early years, she was simply the daughter of the Pope, smiling sweetly while Rome speculated on her fate. Jafar Borgia, the youngest son. Jafar was still a child when Alexander rose to power. Barely out of boyhood, he was often overshadowed by his older siblings. Yet even he would not escape his father's designs. A marriage was arranged for him with Sancha of Aragon, niece of the King of Naples, a union that tied the Borgias to the Neapolitan throne. Jafar's role was clear. He was to be the bridge between his family and one of Italy's most volatile kingdoms. The Vatican transformed with his children elevated. Alexander VI transformed the Vatican itself. No longer merely a seat of faith, it became a palace of power, a family stronghold. He constructed new apartments, decorated with frescoes of triumph and mythology, where banquets and intrigues unfolded night after night. Foreign ambassadors described the Vatican as more court than church, where cardinals mingled with noblemen, courtesans, and mercenaries. Alexander blurred the line between sacred and profane. His mistresses were seen openly, his children celebrated in public processions, his feasts filled with scandalous excess. Rome was shocked, but also enthralled. For centuries, the papacy had hidden its corruption behind veils of piety. Alexander tore the veil away and flaunted his dynasty in the light of day. He was not ashamed, he was proud. Enemies multiplied, but such audacity came at a cost. Old Roman families, the Orsini, the Colonna, the Della Rovere, with resentment. They had long held sway over the papacy, bending weaker popes to their will. But Alexander was different. He was not their puppet, nor their ally. He was building a new power, one that threatened to eclipse them all. Foremost among his enemies was Giuliano della Rovere, nephew of a former pope and a man of volcanic ambition. Della Rovere had once hoped to be pope himself, but Rodrigo's gold had robbed him of the tiara. From the moment Alexander was crowned, Della Rovere vowed to destroy him. He began weaving alliances across Italy and beyond, whispering to kings and princes that the church had fallen into the hands of a monster. And yet, despite his enemies, Alexander's power only grew, with his children strategically placed, with gold flowing from papal coffers, and with Rome firmly under his command. He seemed unstoppable. The Borgias had not only entered the stage of history, they had seized the spotlight. The seeds of rivalry, but within the Borgia family itself, danger was growing. Caesar's resentment of Juan's favoritism deepened with every passing year. Lucretia's marriages became more entangled in politics and betrayal. Jafar's connection to Naples would pull the family into wars far larger than they anticipated. And Alexander himself, though brilliant, could not control the storm he had unleashed. For by crowning his children as his legacy, he had also sown the seeds of their destruction. Rivalries between siblings, enemies at every corner, and the insatiable hunger for more, these would soon consume the house of Borgia. And so, in the glowing halls of the Vatican, beneath the frescoed ceilings and glittering banquets, shadows lengthened. The Borgias were crowned, But in Rome, crowns were often won in blood and lost the same way. Chapter 4. Poison and Power. The Vatican was a fortress of marble, yet its halls were filled with whispers sharper than any blade. Rome, in the age of Alexander VI, was a city where life was cheap, loyalty was bought, and death often came not with a sword, but with a goblet of wine. This was a world where the Borgias thrived, masters of intrigue, masters of deception, and, if the rumors were true, masters of poison. For centuries, historians and chroniclers would argue, did the Borgias truly wield poison as their favorite weapon? Or were these tales born from the malice of their enemies? The truth is lost in the shadows of time, but in Renaissance Italy, rumor itself was a kind of poison, and once it seeped into the bloodstream of the people, it could never be undone. The art of elimination to survive in Rome was to understand that power came not from prayers or sermons, but from the elimination of rivals. Rodrigo Borgia, now Pope Alexander VI, had secured the throne with gold and cunning. But gold could not silence every enemy. The Colonna, the Orsini, the Della Roverethes, great families waited like wolves for their chance to strike. Assassination was as common as confession in Rome. A dagger in the street, a poisoned banquet, a chalice laced with venom, these were the tools of power. It was in this lethal environment that the Borgias earned their reputation. Alexander himself was not known as a man of violence, but as one who orchestrated violence through others. His sons, his allies, his agents, they were the hands that carried out his will. And poison, subtle and untraceable, was said to be their chosen instrument. The banquets of suspicion became arenas of fear. Whenever Alexander hosted feasts in the Vatican, nobles and ambassadors attended with both awe and dread. The tables groaned under the weight of roasted boars, delicate pastries, mountains of fruit, and goblets overflowing with rich wine. But among the glittering dishes lay invisible danger. At least, that is what Rome believed. It was whispered that the Borgias used a secret concoction known as cantarella, clear, tasteless, and deadly. It was said to kill without leaving a trace. Some claimed it came from arsenic, others that it was a potion crafted by alchemists in Alexander's service. Whether cantarella ever truly existed, or whether it was a phantom born from fear, no one can say, but its legend was powerful. And every death that followed a Vatican feast was laid at the Borgias' feet. One story tells of cardinals who fell ill after opposing Alexander in the College of Cardinals, their bodies racked with agony after attending his banquets. Another tale whispers of wealthy Roman nobles who resisted Borgia influence, only to be invited to a dinner where their last toast became their last breath. Yet, for every rumor, there was denial. The Borgias protested innocence, claiming their enemies slandered them with tales of poison to tarnish their reign. Still, the rumors spread faster than any antidote. Caesar's hand in the shadows, if poison was indeed the Borgias' weapon. It was said to be wielded most often by still cloaked in the scarlet robes of a cardinal. Caesar's true ambitions burned hotter with each passing year. He despised the Cossack, despised the rituals, despised being trapped in the service of a church he cared nothing for, and so he looked elsewhere for power in its purest form. It was whispered that Cesare used poison as a tool of control, removing obstacles while keeping his own hands clean. Even the death of his elder brother, Pedro Luis, years earlier, was sometimes attributed to Caesar's ambition, though history leaves that claim in shadow. The truth mattered less than the perception. In Rome, fear was power, and Caesar made sure that fear followed his name. Lucretia and the Black Legend. But no figure in the Borgia family was more entangled in the legends of poison than Lucretia. She was young, beautiful, and intelligent, but her role as her father's political pawn made her a target for scandal. Rumors painted her as the mistress of her father, the lover of her brother, and the wielder of a poison ring from which she could drip death into the chalices of her enemies. Was any of it true? Almost certainly not. Lucretia was little more than a teenager when many of these stories began to circulate, yet gossip cared nothing for truth. To Rome, the image of a golden-haired girl, smiling sweetly as she slipped poison into wine, was irresistible. Chroniclers and enemies alike turned her into a symbol of Borgia corruption, a femme fatale whose innocence hid monstrous deeds, and so, whenever a rival of the Borgias died suddenly, tongues wagged. Lucretia must have done it. She became a phantom of rumor, a walking embodiment of poison itself. A city drowning in fear. Rome in the 1490s became a stage of paranoia. Every cup of wine, every bite of meat, every banquet invitation carried dread. Foreign ambassadors wrote home of the Borgias' supposed poisonings. Poets mocked them in verse, while enemies used the stories to rally opposition. Whether the family truly poisoned as often as claimed is uncertain, but perception was everything. The Borgias were no longer seen merely as rulers, they were seen as predators. To dine with them was to risk death. To cross them was to court disaster. And this reputation, whether deserved or not, gave them extraordinary power. The fall of rivals, several sudden deaths added fuel to the fire. Cardinals who resisted Alexander's policies died unexpectedly, sometimes days after opposing him. Nobles who had once stood proudly against the Borgias vanished from the stage of politics, struck down by mysterious illnesses. Each time, suspicion fell upon the Vatican. Each time, the legend of the Borgias deepened. And yet, there was another truth. Many of these men were old, plagued by the common fevers, plagues, and diseases that swept Renaissance Rome. Food was often spoiled, water contaminated, and death was never far away. But the Borgias had made so many enemies, and wielded so much visible power, that every death was seen as their handiwork. In truth, perhaps poison was not their most deadly weapon. Perhaps it was simply fear. Poison as politics in the end. Whether real or imagined, the Borgias' reputation for poison served them. Fear silenced dissent, kept enemies in check, and elevated their aura of control. They became untouchable not because they were invincible, but because everyone believed they had mastered the art of invisible death. And so, Rome came to a chilling conclusion. The Borgias did not need to poison their enemies. Their enemies poisoned themselves with terror. But fear cuts both ways. Yet fear is a double-edged sword. For every rival silenced, new ones emerged, hardened by hatred. Giuliano della Rovere, the Borgias' greatest enemy, used these tales to his advantage, painting Alexander VI as a monster who had desecrated the papacy. Across Italy, across Europe, the legends of poison stained the family's name, and within the Vatican walls, shadows deepened. Banquets grew quieter, trust grew thinner, and even the Pope himself began to fear the very poison he was accused of wielding. For in a city where every cup might kill, even power itself tasted bitter. Chapter 5. The Cardinal, who became a prince. The crimson robes of the cardinal were meant to symbolize sacrifice, holiness, and devotion to God. But when Cesare Borgia wore them, they were shackles. Beneath the velvet and silk beat the heart of a warrior, not a priest. Every glance in the mirror reminded him of the life stolen from him not by chance, but by design. Rodrigo Borgia, now Pope Alexander VI, had crafted his son's destiny long before Cesare could protest. In an age when second sons were often condemned to the church, while firstborns inherited titles and lands, Cesare was forced into a path that suffocated him. But history has a way of breaking molds. And Cesare Borgia was no ordinary son. The prison of scarlet from the outside, Cesare seemed to embody the role of a cardinal. He moved with grace, spoke with eloquence, and carried himself with the refinement expected of his station. Yet, behind closed doors, his contempt for the church was no secret. Cesare despised the endless ceremonies, the pious masks worn by hypocrites, and the cloistered life that denied him what he truly craved: power of the sword, not the chalice. His letters reveal his restless ambition. He dreamed not of sermons but of banners unfurled across battlefields. He did not imagine saints or martyrs, but castles, cities, and armies bent to his will. Caesar was a wolf, forced into the robes of a shepherd, and the wolf was hungry. Death opens a door. Fate, cruel as it was, delivered him an unexpected gift. In 1497, tragedy struck the Borgia family. Juan, the Duke of Gandia, Caesar's elder brother, and the one destined to carry the secular legacy of the family, was found floating in the Tiber River, his body riddled with stab wounds. Rome erupted in whispers. Who had killed the Pope's son? Some pointed to the Orsini family, eternal enemies of the Borgias. Others whispered of rival noblemen. But the darkest rumor was the one that never faded. Caesar himself had orchestrated the murder. Did Caesar kill his brother? The evidence was circumstantial, the whispers fueled by fear and malice. Yet the truth mattered little. Juan's death created a void, and Caesar was ready to fill it. For the first time in his life, destiny opened its hand. Casting off the robes, Rodrigo Borgia, devastated by Juan's death, hesitated to break church tradition. But Cesare pressed relentlessly. He had no interest in the scarlet robes any longer. He wanted the sword, the horse, the command of armies, and in a move that shocked Europe, Pope Alexander VI granted his son's wish. By papal decree, Caesar resigned his cardinalate, the first man in history to do so willingly, and stepped into a new role. He was named Duke of Valentinois, a title granted by the French crown, and aligned himself with the most powerful monarch in Europe, King Louis XII of France. Rome trembled at the transformation. Caesar was no longer bound by church laws or Vatican etiquette. He was free, and he was dangerous. France, the crucible of power in France. Caesar found everything he craved in knights, armies, and kings who recognized ambition when they saw it. He accompanied Louis XII in his campaigns to claim Milan, and the French king rewarded him with riches and prestige. Caesar was not merely a duke. He was a commander, a prince of war. The French court, dazzled by his charisma and unnerved by his intensity, both admired and feared him. He dressed in gleaming armor, his black hair flowing like a banner of defiance. Chroniclers describe him as magnetic, almost unnaturally so. To men, he was a leader. To women, an irresistible figure. Caesar knew the power of image, and he wielded it as carefully as he wielded his sword. Machiavelli's principle was here, in France and Italy, that Caesar would cross paths with men who would immortalize him. One of them was Niccolò Machiavelli, the Florentine diplomat who watched Cesare with fascination. In Caesar's ambition, cunning, and ruthlessness, Machiavelli saw the blueprint of political genius. Years later, Machiavelli would write The Prince, the most infamous treatise on power in history, and in its pages, he would immortalize Cesare Borgia as the model ruler, the man who understood that power was not given, but seized, not maintained by virtue, but by fear. For Caesar, this was not theory, it was practice. The campaigns in Romania armed with French support, Cesare turned his eyes towards central Italy. The Romania region, fractured and plagued by corrupt local lords, became his target. These petty rulers, often cruel, weak, or both, had long resisted papal control. Cesare, now generalissimo of the papal armies, vowed to bring them to heel. His campaigns were swift and merciless. One by one, the cities of Romania fell under his banner. Imola, Forlic, Rimini fortress after fortress surrendered or was taken by storm. Caesar did not merely conquer, he reorganized, fortified, and centralized. Where others sought plunder, Caesar sought structure. He envisioned an Italy united under firm authority, an Italy where chaos was strangled by the iron grip of order. To some, he was a savior. To others, a tyrant. To all, he was unforgettable. The shadow of violence. Caesar's rise was not without blood. His methods were brutal. In Cesena, He employed a lieutenant named Ramiro de Lorqua to crush dissent. Ramiro ruled with such savagery that the people cried out in terror. And then, in a masterstroke of politics, Cesar turned on his own lieutenant. He had Ramiro executed in the public square, his body left in pieces as a warning. The message was clear: Cesar was merciless, but he was also just. He would tolerate no cruelty but his own. Fear became his greatest weapon, and with it, he held cities in his grasp. A family transformed back in Rome. Alexander VI rejoiced at his son's success. With Caesar's victories, the Borgias extended their reach across Italy. Lucretia, meanwhile, played her role as the family's diplomat, marrying into powerful alliances and serving as regent when needed. The Borgias were no longer merely a family, they were a dynasty. But every dynasty has enemies. The Orsini and Colonna still seethed. Rival nobles plotted in secret, and Giuliano della Rovere, the future Pope Julius II, waited patiently in the shadows, sharpening his hatred like a blade. Cesar had broken free of the church, but in doing so, he had placed himself in the crosshairs of Italy's most powerful enemies. The transformation complete, the cardinal was dead. In his place stood a prince, a general, and a man who embodied both the dream and the nightmare of Renaissance Italy. Cesar was bold, brilliant, and merciless. He did not follow destiny, he created it. But destiny is fickle. And while Caesar's rise seemed unstoppable, the higher he climbed, the further he had to fall. Chapter 6: The Poisoned Cup. The Vatican, by the early 1490s, was no longer just a sacred court of Christendom. It was a theater of power, where alliances were forged in whispers, and betrayal waited at the bottom of a goblet of wine. And no family understood this game better than the Borgias. Rodrigo Borgia, now Pope Alexander VI, had mastered the art of corruption. He wielded it, not as a hidden shame, but as a visible weapon. Every cardinal, every noble, every ambassador who entered his orbit knew one truth: loyalty to the Pope was negotiable, and often paid for in blood or gold. But whispers in Rome spoke of something far darker: the art of poison. The rumors. Some chroniclers claimed that the Borgias kept a secret box of potions, crafted by alchemists and apothecaries. The family's most trusted servants were said to be skilled in the subtle science of death. A pinch of powder slipped into wine, a draught disguised as medicine, a tincture dissolved in souped-up enemies, rivals. Even inconvenient friends, none were safe from the possibility that their next toast might be their last dot. But how much of this was truth, and how much was legend, spun by the Borgias' many enemies? That is the mystery that has haunted their name for centuries. The dinner parties of death accounts tell of glittering banquets at the Vatican Palace. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted boar, sugared fruits, and casks of fine Spanish wine. Nobles and cardinals reclined, laughing, drinking, feasting under golden candlelight. Yet every guest who lifted a cup did so with a sliver of unease. For in Rome, survival meant trusting no one, even the hand that poured your wine. One story speaks of a banquet where several nobles fell ill the same night. Some whispered they had crossed the Borgias, others insisted it was mere food poisoning. But the rumor grew that the family's goblets themselves were traps. One cup poisoned, another safe. The choice offered depending on whether you were friend or foe. The poison of power. Why poison? For the Borgias, it was not only a weapon, but a message. Blades and armies could be traced, assassins could be caught. But poison lit, invisible, was the perfect tool for a family that thrived in shadows. To poison a man was to remind Rome that the Borgias' reach extended beyond walls, beyond guards, beyond swords. You could be laughing with Cesar Borgia, or toasting with Pope Alexander himself. And still, in that laughter, your last breath was being drawn. Cesare and Lucretia, much of the fear circled around two of Rodrigo's children. Cesare and Lucretia. Cesare, The calculating warrior was said to supply his father with victims, using poison to weaken rivals before crushing them militarily. Lucretia, too, was accused perhaps unfairly of wielding poison as a weapon in her marriages. Chroniclers painted her as a dark enchantress, smiling sweetly as she offered wine to a doomed husband or political rival. But was she truly a conspirator? Or simply a young woman entangled in the poisonous rumors surrounding her family? History remains divided. The infamous Cantarellism said the Borgias used a special brew known as Cantarella. Descriptions varied: a crystalline powder, a white paste, even a black liquid said to be sweet to the taste. According to legend, it killed slowly, sometimes over hours, sometimes over days, making it nearly impossible to trace. Victims would suffer agonizing cramps, convulsions, and vomiting before slipping into death. No vial of Cantarella has ever been found. Was it real, or a myth invented by enemies desperate to explain the Borgias' uncanny ability to outlive their rivals? The thin line between fact and fear here lies the genius of the Borgias. Whether or not they truly wielded poison as often as whispered, the mere belief in their methods worked as powerfully as the act itself. Every noble who entered the Pope's court, every envoy who drank his wine, every suitor who courted Lucretia, they all knew the rumors. And that fear was worth more than any blade. The unanswered questions were: the Borgias truly master poisoners? Or were they simply victims of one of history's most effective smear campaigns? The truth may never be known. But the fact remains, by the time Pope Alexander VI had secured his throne, the word Borgia itself was enough to strike terror into the heart of Rome, and in a city ruled by both faith and fear. Terror was the greatest power of all. Chapter 7. The Wolf of Rome trembled under the weight of whispers. For all the talk of poisoned goblets and secret potions, the real terror of the Borgia name was not liquid in a cup, but blood in the streets. And at the center of this storm stood one man, Cesare Borgia. He was called many things: a cardinal, a prince, a soldier, a murderer. But soon, Italy would know him by another name: the Wolf of Rome. The birth of an heir and an outlaw, Cesare was Rodrigo Borgia's second son. Unlike Juan, his older brother Cesare was not raised to inherit titles or lands. Instead, Rodrigo forced him into the church. At just 18, Cesare was made a bishop. By 20, a cardinal. But Cesare was no priest. He was restless, fierce, a man who despised sermons and sacraments. His true calling lay not at the altar, but on the battlefield. His sharp eyes and iron will belonged to the world of war, not worship. In private, he raged at the prison of his robes. To those who knew him best, Cesare's destiny was clear. He was not made to bless. He was made to conquer. Shadows of jealousy. Rodrigo, now Pope Alexander VI, adored his eldest son Juan. The Pope named him Duke of Gandia, showered him with honors, and whispered dreams of making him ruler of Spain. But Juan lacked the cunning and cruelty of his brother. He was arrogant, indulgent, careless. Cesare watched with burning eyes as the father gave to Juan what Cesare believed was his by right: power. Their rivalry grew in silence, each brother circling the other like wolves waiting for the first strike. And then, one night in June 1497, the streets of Rome ran red. The murder of Juan's body was found floating in the Tiber River, riddled with stab wounds. The city gasped. Who had dared strike down the Pope's favorite son? Some whispered of Spanish rivals, others of jealous nobles. But many eyes turned to Cesare. He alone stood to gain from Juan's death. With his brother gone, the chains of priesthood could be broken. Did Cesare order the murder? Did he plunge the dagger himself? History leaves the question in shadows, but what is certain is this: the night Juan Borgia died, Cesare was reborn. He cast off his cardinal's robes and stepped into armor. From priest to prince, from servant of God to servant of power, Caesar had transformed into the weapon his father had always needed. The Pope's enforcer, Pope Alexander VI, wasted no time. He proclaimed Cesare Duke of Valentinos and arranged a marriage with a French princess, Charlotte d'Albret, binding the Borgias to France's king. This alliance gave Caesar the might he craved: soldiers, cannons, and the legitimacy of European royalty. Soon, Caesar began his campaign, a ruthless conquest of Italy's fractured city-states. Florence, Bologna, Forlic, Rimini, Urbino, each one was a jewel in the crown he sought to forge. But Cesare was no ordinary conqueror. He fought not only with steel, but with terror. He understood the psychology of fear, the art of intimidation. To him, power was not merely seized. It was performed at the campaign of blood in 1500. Cesare unleashed a campaign across the Romagna, a northern region of Italy. His strategy was swift and merciless. Strike hard, strike fast. Leave no doubt. Those who resisted were crushed with fire and sword. Cities that surrendered quickly were spared for a time. But rebellion was answered with brutality. Chroniclers tell of heads displayed on spikes, bodies left to rot in the sun, whole families slaughtered to set examples. Yet amid the carnage, Caesar also brought order. Bandits were executed, lawlessness ended, roads cleared of thieves. To some, he was a monster. To others, a deliverer. Fear and admiration, horror and loyalty, Cesare fed on both. The Machiavellian Principe was during these years that Caesar caught the eye of a Florentine diplomat named Niccolò Machiavelli. Machiavelli was fascinated. He observed Caesar's cunning, his boldness, his merciless efficiency. To Machiavelli, Cesare Borgia embodied the very essence of political genius. Years later, Machiavelli would write The Prince, his infamous guide to power and rule. And who was his model? None other than Cesare Borgia. Cesare Machiavelli wrote, was a man who laid foundations with the power of others, which fortune then allowed him to build upon with his own strength. He was the living example of what it meant to be ruthless, calculating, and unshakably ambitious. The Wolf of Rome had become a legend in his own lifetime, the shadow of Lucretia. But Caesar's rise was not only on the battlefield. In the courts of Italy, his sister Lucretia became his political partner. Their bond was unnervingly close, so close that rumors began to swirl. Enemies whispered that the two shared more than a sibling's affection. Stories of incest spread like wildfire through Europe. Were they true? Historians remain divided. Perhaps they were nothing more than slander, designed to blacken the Borgia's name further. But whether truth or lie, the rumors added to the aura of dread surrounding He was not only a soldier of steel, but of scandal. Every whisper, every accusation deepened his reputation as a man without limits. Caesar's wolf-pack Caesar did not fight alone. He surrounded himself with men as ruthless as himself, mercenaries, condottieri, and assassins. Foremost among them was a mercenary captain named Micheletto Carella, Caesar's loyal shadow. Wherever Caesar went, Micheletto followed, carrying out executions, tortures, and secret killings with quiet precision. Together, they carved a trail of fear across Italy. Nobles locked their gates, priests prayed for deliverance, and peasants whispered of the Duke of Valentinois, the wolf who devoured all in his path. The fall of Forgotten, of Caesar's most infamous campaigns, was against the fortress city of Forgotten, ruled by the formidable Caterina Sforza. Caterina was no ordinary foe. Known as the Tiger of Fork, she was fierce, cunning, and unafraid of the Borgia's power. When Caesar laid siege to her city in 1499, she stood defiantly on the walls, mocking his cannons, daring him to fire. But Caesar's patience was greater than her defiance. His artillery reduced her defenses to rubble, his troops stormed the city, and Caterina was taken prisoner. The message was clear: no matter how strong, no city, no woman, No dynasty could withstand the Wolf of Rome. The puppet master behind Cesare stood his father, Pope Alexander VI, orchestrating the grand design. The Pope used Caesar as his sword, striking down rivals and securing territory for the papacy. Together, they dreamed of a new Rome, not the old empire of Caesars, but a new dynasty of Borgias, ruling Italy like monarchs. Feared and obeyed across Christendom, it was a dream of blood and ambition, of thrones built on corpses, and with Caesar at its head, it seemed unstoppable. The wolf, at his height by 1502, Cesare Borgia stood at the peak of his power. He controlled vast territories in central Italy, commanded armies of mercenaries, and inspired terror in every rival's heart. Machiavelli himself admitted, "I do not know what better advice to give to a prince than to follow the example of Cesare Borgia. But history is a cruel stage, and as Cesare looked down from his summit, he could not see the storm gathering on the horizon. For fortune, as Machiavelli himself would later write, is fickle, and when it turns against you, even the wolf may fall." The shadow of doom. The Borgias believed themselves untouchable, but even wolves bleed. In the summer heat of 1503, a banquet was prepared. Wine was poured, meat roasted, laughter echoed in the Vatican halls, but somewhere, in the shadows, a poison waited, and this time, it would not be poured for the Borgias' enemies. Chapter 9. Machiavelli's Prince. Italy in the late 1490s was a fractured landscape, a theater of ambition, betrayal, and shifting allegiances. Venice, Florence, Milan, and Naples all vied for dominance, their armies clashing, their diplomats scheming, and their courts whispering secrets that could topple kingdoms. Amid this chaos rose Cesare Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander VI, a figure whose very name inspired fear and awe, whose ambition knew no bounds, and whose calculated ruthlessness would come to define an era. Caesar's early years had been shaped by the dual forces of family loyalty and political necessity. Born into the notorious Borgia dynasty, he was groomed to wield power from a young age, initially destined for the church. His trajectory shifted dramatically following the mysterious death of his elder brother Juan and the strategic maneuverings of his father. Freed from ecclesiastical constraints, Caesar embraced the path of the warrior, wielding sword and strategy with equal precision. To understand Cesare Borgia is to understand the volatile theater of Renaissance Italy. City-states were independent, yet perpetually entangled in shifting alliances. Loyalties were fragile, and betrayal was a constant companion. Caesar moved with precision through this treacherous landscape, striking when others hesitated and exploiting weaknesses with a surgeon's touch. His military genius and political cunning were not merely products of ambition. They were instruments of survival in a world where hesitation meant death. Niccolò Machiavelli, the Florentine diplomat and chronicler of political theory, observed Cesare during this period and would later immortalize him as the archetype of the political prince. To Machiavelli, Cesare represented the ultimate embodiment of pragmatic power, man who understood that morality was subordinate to necessity, and that the appearance of virtue could be as powerful as its reality. Caesar's combination of charisma, strategic foresight, and ruthless efficiency would become a model for rulers for centuries to come. Caesar's campaigns were as psychological as they were military. He understood fear as a tool, one that complemented his alliances and military maneuvers. Cities that resisted his influence often found their leaders disappearing under mysterious circumstances, their populations cowed by swift demonstrations of his might. His reputation preceded him. Whispers of poison, betrayal, and sudden violence softened resistance before any sword was drawn. One of Caesar's most remarkable achievements was the consolidation of Rome, a patchwork of duchies and principalities long plagued by fragmented rule. Each territory presented unique challenges, From rival lords entrenched in centuries-old disputes to populations fiercely loyal to their local rulers, Caesar approached these challenges with meticulous planning. He studied allegiances, observed character, and gauged the sentiment of the people. Through a combination of diplomacy, intimidation, and decisive military action, he brought these territories under his control, demonstrating that power was not just seized, it was orchestrated. Every conquest reinforced the Borgia image of both fear and authority. Caesar understood that perception was as critical as reality. A ruler who inspired awe could command obedience without constant enforcement. Public executions, theatrical displays of punishment, and the calculated elimination of rivals were as much about shaping perception as achieving practical goals. Caesar's mastery of this principle ensured that cities bent to his will not merely out of fear, but out of recognition of his inescapable influence. Despite his growing power, Caesar was not immune to the challenges of family dynamics. Alexander VI's support was both a boon and a constraint. The Pope's authority provided legitimacy, yet Caesar's rising fame sometimes cast a shadow over his father. Within Rome, factions whispered that the son might one day rival the father, a dynamic that introduced both tension and motivation into Caesar's strategies. Balancing filial loyalty with personal ambition became a delicate task, one that required both diplomacy and ruthlessness. Caesar's approach to alliances was similarly calculated. France, Naples, Venice, and Florence all kept a wary eye on him. His intentions were never fully transparent, compelling rivals to act prematurely and reveal their weaknesses. In the theater of Renaissance politics, Caesar was both playwright and actor, manipulating every narrative to serve his ambition. Each marriage, treaty, and military engagement was a move on the chessboard of Italy, designed to maximize his family's influence and extend their dominion. Yet, with all his successes, Caesar's methods were not universally admired. Tales of poison, secret murders, and corruption followed him, creating a legend as much as a reality. Propaganda by enemies painted him as a monster, a prince devoid of morality, while supporters saw him as a brilliant strategist whose ambition reshaped the Italian political landscape. The duality of his reputation, feared and respected, vilified and celebrated, was a testament to his complex understanding of power. Machiavelli's observation of Cesare crystallized in the principles that would later inform his seminal work, The Prince. Caesar embodied the idea that effective leadership requires flexibility, decisiveness, and a willingness to transcend conventional morality when necessary. His actions demonstrated that power was not merely inherited or earned through virtue, but actively maintained through calculation, fear, and strategic alliances. Caesar's life became a case study in the intersection of intellect, ambition, and ruthlessness. The political landscape of Italy during Caesar's rise was as volatile as it was dynamic. City-states were fragile constructs, perpetually vulnerable to external invasion or internal rebellion. Caesar's campaigns altered this balance, demonstrating that a single visionary and ruthless actor could dominate not merely through force but through a combination of strategy, perception, and psychological manipulation. His successes reshaped alliances and challenged the assumptions of neighboring powers. Caesar's legacy, even in his lifetime, was evident. His combination of strategic foresight, martial skill, and political manipulation allowed him to carve a sphere of influence unmatched by any contemporary. The Borgia's transformation of the papacy into a vehicle of temporal power was cemented, with Caesar as both architect and executor. Yet, for all his brilliance, the seeds of future challenges were already sown. Ambition provokes envy, and unrivaled power invites opposition. Every campaign, every negotiation, every act of ruthlessness was calculated with an eye toward legacy. Caesar understood that history would judge him not only for his victories, but for his audacity. He moved through Italy like a shadow, leaving both and fear in his wake, and teaching Europe that ambition, when combined with intellect and ruthlessness, could reshape nations, as the French, Neapolitan, and Venetian powers observed Cesare. They realized that he was more than a prince. He was a paradigm. His influence extended beyond military conquest. It affected diplomacy, culture, and the perception of the papacy itself. Where once the Pope had been seen purely as a spiritual leader, now his son demonstrated that the papal family could wield temporal authority with lethal efficiency. Cesare Borgia's campaigns also illustrated a fundamental principle of power. Control is as much psychological as it is physical. By fostering fear, cultivating respect, and demonstrating decisiveness, he ensured compliance without constant oversight. Cities submitted not merely because of military strength but because resistance seemed futile, and loyalty appeared advantageous. Through these actions, Cesare left an indelible mark on the Italian peninsula. He reshaped Romania, redefined the role of papal families in political affairs, and inspired a generation of thinkers, most notably who would enshrine Caesar's methods in the enduring study of political power. Caesar's rise was a masterclass in the orchestration of ambition, strategy, and ruthlessness. By the end of this period, Cesare Borgia had established himself as a dominant force in Italy, a figure whose reputation for both brilliance and cruelty ensured that his name would echo through history. Machiavelli, observing, chronicling, and analyzing, saw in Cesare the very embodiment of the principles that would come to define effective rule: decisiveness, pragmatism, and the calculated use of fear and perception. Cesare had become more than a prince. He had become a symbol, a living example of power, wielded with intelligence and ruthlessness in the shadows of Renaissance Italy. Where betrayal was currency and ambition was law, Cesare Borgia stood unrivaled. His campaigns, alliances, and strategies demonstrated that mastery of power required more than force. It demanded insight, timing, and the courage to act when others hesitated. Through him, the Borgia's name became synonymous with influence and infamy, a dynasty whose shadow would darken Italy long after the fall of its most notorious members. And so, as the city-states of Italy braced for the consequences of Caesar's campaigns, the world watched a man whose ambition redefined what it meant to wield power. Fear and respect, manipulation and strategy, loyalty and betrayal, all became tools in the hands of a master. Cesare Borgia had become the archetype of the prince, the model for Machiavelli, and the embodiment of ambition incarnate. The stage was set, the players positioned, and the legacy of the Borgias surged forward with unstoppable momentum. Chapter 10. The Web of Alliances. The Italian peninsula at the turn of the 16th century was a complex tapestry of rivalries, loyalties, and shifting allegiances. It was a land where a single betrayal could topple a city-state, and a well-placed alliance could elevate a family to unprecedented heights of power. In this intricate web of politics, the Borgias, under the guidance of Pope Alexander VI and the strategic genius of Cesare Borgia, wove a network of influence that stretched across Rome, Florence, Milan, Naples, and even France. Their objective was clear: to consolidate power, protect their family, and expand the temporal authority of the papacy. At the heart of this network was whose cunning and ambition transformed alliances into instruments of dominance. No longer constrained by the Church's expectations, he wielded diplomacy and intimidation with equal precision. He understood that military might alone could not secure lasting influence. It had to be complemented by carefully orchestrated political bonds. Marriages, treaties, and temporary truces were all calculated moves, each designed to reinforce the Borgia family's position while simultaneously weakening potential rivals. The French connection was particularly crucial. Charles VIII of France, a young and ambitious king, had entered Italy with designs on the Kingdom of Naples. The Borgias recognized both the threat and the opportunity this presented. Through careful negotiation and subtle manipulation, they positioned themselves as indispensable allies, offering support where advantageous and creating tension where it could be exploited. Caesar's ability to read intentions, anticipate moves, and exploit the ambitions of others allowed him to maneuver Rome into a position of relative strength, even amidst foreign intervention. In Florence, the Medici were both allies and rivals. The Borgias cultivated friendships, paid for favors, and simultaneously kept a network of spies to monitor every move. Florence's internal politics were notoriously volatile, and Caesar's ability to navigate these currents without committing fully to any side demonstrated his mastery of subtle power. Every decision was layered. A marriage might secure a temporary alliance, while secret communication could reveal weaknesses in rival factions, enabling Caesar to strike decisively when the moment was right. Milan and Venice presented a different challenge. The Sforza family in Milan and the Venetian oligarchy operated with their own traditions of influence and diplomacy. Caesar's approach here required patience and observation. He studied their strengths and vulnerabilities, sending emissaries, offering incentives, and at times, hinting at potential military force. In this high-stakes game, a single misstep could provoke war or collapse a fragile truce. Caesar's skill lay in his ability to maintain balance, projecting both power and restraint, ensuring that the Borgias remained central in any calculation of influence. The use of marriage as a political tool reached its zenith with the Borgia children. Lucretia's unions, carefully arranged and renegotiated, served to cement alliances or neutralize threats. Caesar's siblings and other relatives were positioned strategically across Italian states, forming a lattice of loyalty and dependence that strengthened the family's reach. These marital alliances were not mere social arrangements. They were tactical maneuvers designed to extend influence, manipulate power dynamics, and create channels for intelligence gathering. Yet, not all alliances were built on trust. The Borgias thrived in ambiguity, often presenting a facade of cooperation while harboring ulterior motives. Poison, deception, and covert manipulation were part of the arsenal. Caesar was particularly adept at exploiting uncertainty, forcing allies and rivals alike to make decisions in a climate of fear and suspicion. By controlling the flow of information, he ensured that the Borgias retained the upper hand, turning every interaction into an opportunity for leverage. That balance of power was further complicated by the presence of mercenary armies, whose loyalty could be purchased and whose swords could be decisive in local conflicts. Caesar's ability to hire, deploy, and strategically employ these forces amplified his influence. These armies were both shield and instrument, protecting the family's interests while projecting the power necessary to enforce political arrangements and intimidate adversaries. One of the most significant aspects of the Borgia web of alliances was its adaptability. Caesar understood that loyalty was fluid and that circumstances could change rapidly. When an ally became a threat, he was ready to act decisively, either through negotiation, coercion, or, when necessary, military action. This flexibility allowed the Borgias to respond effectively to crises, maintain dominance in Rome, and extend their influence across the peninsula. The Vatican itself became a hub of both diplomacy and intrigue. Pope Alexander VI's court was a theater where negotiations were conducted alongside the subtle display of wealth and power. Caesar's presence in these halls was both commanding and intimidating. He moved effortlessly between the sacred and the secular, balancing his father's authority with his own strategic ambitions. Within the walls of the Vatican, alliances were forged, spies exchanged information, and the fate of regions was often decided in whispers rather than in open conflict. The Borgias' manipulation of alliances extended to external powers beyond Italy. France, in particular, was a critical player. Caesar maintained correspondence with French nobles, negotiated terms of support, and leveraged France's military ambitions to his own advantage. By intertwining the Borghese interests with those of a major European power, Cesar elevated the family's position from local players to influential actors on the continental stage. However, the intricate web of alliances was not without danger. Rival families, such as the Orsini and Colonna, constantly sought to undermine the Borgias. Missteps could result in sudden attacks, rebellions, or the collapse of key relationships. Caesar's genius lay in his ability to anticipate threats, manipulate perceptions, and act preemptively, often turning potential disasters into opportunities for consolidation of power. The consequences of these alliances were felt in every corner of Italy. Cities, principalities, and even smaller lordships found themselves entangled in the Borgia's network, forced to weigh loyalty against survival, cooperation against betrayal. Caesar's reputation for decisive action, strategic brilliance, and ruthless efficiency ensured that the balance of power tilted in the Borgia's favor more often than not. Fear and respect combined to secure their dominance. At the same time, the Borgia family carefully cultivated the image of legitimacy and divine favor. While their methods were often ruthless, the outward display of devotion and piety provided cover for political maneuvering. The Pope's authority, combined with Caesar's strategic acumen, allowed the family to navigate the moral and spiritual expectations of the time, creating a delicate but effective facade. The culmination of these alliances was a network of influence that touched every major political player in Italy. Rome was secured, key territories in central Italy were under Borgia control, and external powers like France were engaged in complex negotiations that enhanced rather than diminished the family's power. Through marriage, diplomacy, and calculated intimidation, the Borgias transformed the papacy from a spiritual institution into a formidable political dynasty. Yet, as with all empires built on intrigue and alliances, cracks appeared beneath the surface. Rivals plotted, rumors of betrayal circulated, and the delicate balance of loyalty could be disrupted by a single miscalculation. Caesar's ability to maintain this network required constant vigilance, keen insight, and the willingness to act decisively when threats emerged. The legacy of the Borgia's web of alliances was profound. They demonstrated that power was not merely about wealth or military might. It was about relationships, perception, and strategic manipulation. By intertwining familial, political, and diplomatic interests, they created a structure that extended their influence far beyond what was traditionally possible for a papal family. Caesar's execution of these strategies would leave a lasting impression on Italian politics, setting a standard for the use of alliances as instruments of power. In this turbulent landscape, Cesare Borgia emerged as both master and architect of a complex network that combined fear, loyalty, manipulation, and opportunity. Every marriage, every treaty, every carefully cultivated relationship served to strengthen the Borgia's hold over Italy. The family's influence, once confined to Rome, now extended across the peninsula, shaping the political, military, and social dynamics of the time. As the shadow of the Borgias stretched across Italy, it became clear that alliances were more than temporary conveniences. They were instruments of enduring power. Caesar's genius lay not only in his ability to form these alliances, but also in his capacity to wield them with precision, adapting to changing circumstances and exploiting every opportunity for advancement. In doing so, he transformed the landscape of Italy, leaving an indelible mark on history and demonstrating that in the world of Renaissance politics, survival and dominance depended as much on cunning and connections as on force of arms. The web of alliances crafted by the Borgias was more than a strategy. It was a living, evolving system that enabled them to control Rome, influence Italy, and project power far beyond the city's walls. Chapter 11. Lucretia's infamy. Lucretia Borgia, the daughter of Pope Alexander VI, was born into a world where power and scandal were inseparable. From her earliest days, she was surrounded by whispers of ambition, betrayal, and manipulation. Her family's name carried both awe and fear, and the young Lucretia would become a symbol of the Borgia's influence, a figure whose life was both orchestrated and scrutinized by the courts of Italy. Her story, a complex tapestry of innocence, cunning, and political necessity, demonstrates how the daughters of powerful families were often pawns and players in equal measure, married off at a young age to secure political alliances. Lucretia was thrust into the heart of Renaissance intrigue before she could fully understand the consequences. Her first marriage, to Giovanni Sforza, the Lord of Pesaro, was a strategic move orchestrated by her father. It was intended to solidify ties with the powerful Sforza family in Milan. Yet the union, though politically advantageous, became a tool for scandal and rumor, as the Borgias sought to navigate both the familial and political landscapes of Italy. Lucretia's second marriage, to Alfonso of Aragon, was marked by even darker intrigue. Alfonso's violent death, widely believed to have been orchestrated by Caesura, cast a long shadow over Lucretia's reputation. Her name became entwined with rumors of poison, betrayal, and immorality. Every court in Italy whispered tales of her alleged complicity, whether true or fabricated, turning her life into a theater of public scrutiny. Yet, behind the stories, Lucretia navigated these challenges with intelligence and grace, adapting to the expectations placed upon her while managing the delicate balance between duty and survival. Throughout her life, Lucretia's role as a political instrument was clear. Marriages were tools, each designed to secure alliances or neutralize potential threats. Yet, within this constrained existence, she developed a keen understanding of influence and power. She became a master of social diplomacy, using her charm, intellect, and presence to maneuver within the complex networks of Italian politics. Her ability to negotiate, persuade, and survive in a male-dominated world speaks to a subtle strength often overlooked amidst the sensational tales of her alleged misdeeds. The perception of Lucretia as a figure of scandal was amplified by her father's notoriety and Caesar's ruthlessness. Tales of her involvement in poisonings, incest, and political manipulations circulated widely, often fueled by rival families seeking to tarnish the Borgia legacy. Yet historians continue to debate the veracity of these claims. Much of Lucretia's infamy may have been the product of propaganda, a reflection of the fear and jealousy her family inspired in others. Regardless, she became a symbol of the Borgia's complex mixture of power, ambition, and moral ambiguity. Lucretia's political influence extended beyond mere appearances. She acted as a mediator, a diplomat, and at times, an advisor. Her marriages provided connections to key families across Italy, enabling her to serve as a conduit of information and influence. Her ability to navigate the intricate social and political landscapes of multiple courts demonstrates that she was more than a passive figure. She was an active participant in the Borgia strategy, wielding her position to further her family's interests, while safeguarding her own survival. The cultural and social environment of Renaissance Italy amplified Lucretia's visibility. Courts were centers of art, philosophy, and literature, but they were also arenas for gossip, reputation, and reputation management. In this world, a woman's actions were scrutinized and interpreted as reflections of both personal and familial virtue. Lucretia's every move, every appearance, and every relationship was observed and reported, often with embellishment. Her life illustrates how power, gender, and perception intersected in the volatile world of Italian politics. Despite the dangers, Lucretia found ways to exert agency. She cultivated relationships with influential figures, participated in courtly negotiations, and navigated the treacherous waters of familial ambition. Her intelligence and adaptability allowed her to survive scandals that might have destroyed others, transforming her infamy into a tool for influence. By embracing the roles imposed upon her, While subtly shaping her own path, Lucretia demonstrated resilience and acumen, rarely acknowledged in historical accounts dominated by tales of her supposed moral failings. Lucretia's later marriages, including her union with Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, further illustrate her strategic importance. These marriages reinforced alliances, stabilized regions, and connected the Borgias to powerful dynasties beyond Rome. Her presence at the courts of Ferrara, her patronage of the arts, and her participation in political negotiations highlight a woman who managed to translate the constraints of her position into avenues of agency and influence. She became both a symbol and an actor within the broader narrative of Borgia power. The infamy surrounding Lucretia was not solely a product of her family's ambition. It was also a reflection of contemporary attitudes toward women in power. Her life was a battleground of perception, where rumors and reality intertwined. While her reputation suffered from exaggeration and slander, her ability to navigate these challenges demonstrates a remarkable intelligence and subtlety. She mastered the art of survival in a world that often sought to define women by the ambitions and sins of the men around them. Throughout her life, Lucretia's influence was both direct and indirect. Through marriage, negotiation, and social maneuvering, she impacted the political and social landscape of Italy. Her connections extended to multiple courts, enabling the Borgias to coordinate strategies, gather intelligence, and exert influence across regions. Her presence in these networks illustrates that she was an integral part of the family's approach to power, a participant in both diplomacy and strategy. Even as rumors of scandal swirled, Lucretia maintained a degree of control over her life and legacy. She became a patron of the arts, supporting music, literature, and architecture, thereby creating a cultural footprint that complemented the political ambitions of her family. These efforts contributed to the Borgias' broader strategy of influence, blending the exercise of power with the cultivation of prestige and legacy. Lucretia's story also underscores the tension between personal agency and familial duty. She was constrained by the expectations of her father and brother, yet she found avenues to assert her own identity within these constraints. Her intelligence, diplomacy, and adaptability allowed her to navigate crises, mitigate threats, and maintain her position in the complex hierarchy of Italian politics. The legend of Lucretia Borgia, a mixture of reality and myth, endures because it embodies the contradictions of power. She was at once victim and manipulator, scandalized and celebrated, constrained and influential. Her life illuminates the ways in which women could exercise subtle, yet significant power in a patriarchal society, even when their actions were overshadowed by sensationalized stories and propaganda. In the courts of Italy, Lucretia became a figure whose reputation preceded her. The rumors of poison, intrigue, and manipulation served as both warnings and enhancements of her influence. Allies and enemies alike measured her not just by her lineage, but by her ability to maneuver through the perilous landscape of Renaissance politics. Every interaction was an opportunity to assert influence, and every scandal was transformed into a tool for maintaining the Borgias' dominance. Through all of these trials, Lucretia's resilience and intelligence ensured her survival. She adapted to changing circumstances, negotiated the shifting sands of alliances, and maintained her position despite the constant threat of scandal or political attack. In doing so, she exemplified the subtle power that women could wield in a world dominated by male authority, transforming her infamy into a resource that advanced both her own position and that of her family. Lucretia Borgia's life, though shrouded in scandal and myth, reflects the complexities of power, gender, and perception in Renaissance Italy. She was a daughter, a sister, a wife, and a political actor, whose every move was scrutinized and interpreted in the context of her family's ambitions. Her story demonstrates that influence can be exercised in many forms, and that survival and agency often require navigating the shadows of rumor, expectation, and societal constraints. Ultimately, Lucretia's infamy was inseparable from the broader narrative of the Borgia family. Her marriages, her intelligence, and her resilience were integral to the consolidation of Borgia power, even as legends painted her as a figure of scandal. In understanding Lucretia, one sees not only the consequences of ambition and reputation, but also the ways in which perception can become a tool of power. She stands as a testament to the enduring complexities of human influence, a woman whose life continues to fascinate historians, storytellers, and those drawn to the shadows of history. As Rome watched and whispered, Lucretia's presence shaped both the politics and the myths of her era. She navigated her family's ambitions with grace and cunning, embodying the contradictions of power and reputation. The Borgia's daughter, though often maligned, became an essential instrument in the orchestration of one of history's most infamous dynasties. And in her infamy, she found a kind of enduring influence that few women of her time could claim, leaving a legacy that remains inextricably linked to the legend and shadow of the Borgia name. Chapter 12. The Vatican as a Fortress under the reign of Pope Alexander VI. The Vatican transformed from a spiritual center into a formidable fortress, a symbol of both religious authority and temporal power. Rome, already a city steeped in politics, culture, and intrigue, became the stage for a new era of control, opulence, and fear. The Vatican was no longer merely a house of God. It was a palace of strategy, where power was measured as much by the placement of allies and enemies as by prayer and ceremony. Within these walls, the Borgias orchestrated a delicate balance of splendor and terror, ensuring their dominance while projecting an image of divine legitimacy. Alexander VI understood that the papacy could be both a spiritual and political instrument. The Vatican's fortifications were enhanced, armies maintained, and an intricate web of spies and informants monitored the city's movements. The Pope's court became a theater where alliances were tested, loyalty was demanded, and betrayal was anticipated. Every ceremony, banquet, and public display served multiple purposes: to impress, to intimidate, and to subtly manipulate the perceptions of both allies and adversaries. Cesare Borgia, moving between military campaigns and the papal court, reinforced this atmosphere of authority, demonstrating that the Vatican was both a sanctuary and a command center. The architecture and layout of the Vatican were leveraged to reinforce power. Grand halls, ornate chambers, and strategic vantage points allowed the Pope and his family to maintain control over the flow of information, guests, and emissaries. Access to Alexander VI was carefully controlled. Only those who could serve the family's interests were allowed close proximity. In this controlled environment, the Borgias could project an image of invincibility, while simultaneously gathering intelligence to neutralize threats before they materialized. Security within the Vatican extended beyond physical fortifications. The Borgias cultivated a culture of fear, ensuring that rumors of punishment and betrayal circulated freely. Courtiers, clergy, and visiting dignitaries all understood that loyalty was rewarded, while disloyalty or even perceived disloyalty could be met with swift consequences. This psychological control was as effective as any wall or guard, creating an environment where power was internalized by those within the papal sphere. The Vatican's role as a fortress also involved the careful management of information. Correspondence, reports from regional governors, and intelligence gathered by spies were meticulously reviewed and acted upon. Caesar's campaigns in Romania and other regions relied on timely knowledge of political shifts, rival movements, and local sentiments. The Vatican served as the central hub for this network, allowing the Borgias to coordinate military, political, and social strategies with precision. Banquets and public ceremonies, often grandiose and lavish, masked the darker realities of Borgia rule. while observers marveled at the extravagance. Alexander VI and Caesar used these occasions to solidify alliances, issue subtle threats, and observe the interactions of both friends and foes. Every gesture, conversation, and seating arrangement was calculated to maximize influence and reinforce hierarchy. Through spectacle and strategy, the Vatican became both a palace of awe and a fortress of fear. The Borgias also recognized the symbolic power of the Vatican's religious authority by intertwining spiritual imagery with displays of temporal power. They reinforced the perception that their rule was sanctioned by God. This blending of faith and politics enhanced their legitimacy, allowing them to wield influence over secular and ecclesiastical spheres simultaneously. The careful management of rituals, ceremonies, and public appearances ensured that the Pope's authority remained unchallenged, even in the face of dissent or conspiracy. However, the fortress was not merely defensive. It was a launching point for expansion and enforcement. Caesar's military campaigns were coordinated from within its walls, with intelligence and strategy flowing seamlessly between court and battlefield. Orders were dispatched, alliances negotiated, and threats neutralized, all under the watchful eyes of the Pope and his advisors. The Vatican's combination of splendor and strategy created a unique environment in which power could be both projected and controlled with remarkable efficiency. Within this fortified environment, the dynamics of fear and loyalty played out daily. Courtiers, officials, and military leaders were constantly evaluated for their usefulness and allegiance. The slightest hint of disloyalty could result in demotion, exile, or worse. This constant tension ensured that the Borgias maintained the upper hand, cultivating an atmosphere in which obedience was as much a product of fear as of respect. The Vatican's role as a fortress extended beyond the city of Rome. Diplomatic correspondence, strategic marriages, and covert operations all emanated from this central hub, connecting the Borgia family to political currents across Italy and Europe. From these walls, Alexander VI and Caesar orchestrated a network of influence that reached far beyond the papal territories, shaping alliances, provoking rivalries, and consolidating power through a combination of diplomacy, intimidation, and military action. Despite its strength, the Vatican was also a place of vulnerability. The same concentration of power that allowed the Borgias to dominate politics made them targets for envy, conspiracy, and assassination. Caesar's ruthlessness and Alexander's ambition ensured that threats were dealt with swiftly. But the constant vigilance required to maintain control created an atmosphere of perpetual tension. Every visitor, every courier, every conversation could contain the seeds of betrayal, and the Borgias had to navigate this landscape with constant care. The fortification of the Vatican was both practical and symbolic. It communicated to all who entered that power was concentrated, monitored, and protected. It served as a reminder that the Pope was not merely a spiritual leader, but also a temporal ruler whose authority was enforced through intelligence, strategy, and force. Within this environment, the Borgias demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of power. It was as much about perception, manipulation, and control as it was about wealth and armies. Over time, the Vatican as a fortress became an extension of Borgia ambition. It was a center of coordination for political campaigns, a refuge for plotting and planning, and a stage for ceremonial displays that reinforced dominance. The walls, halls, and courtyards were imbued with both awe and dread, a tangible manifestation of the Borgia's capacity to blend authority with intimidation. The presence of Caesar within the Vatican further amplified its strategic function. His command of intelligence, military expertise, and political acumen allowed the Pope to project power efficiently and decisively. Caesar's interactions with foreign dignitaries, regional governors, and local nobles were carefully managed, ensuring that the Vatican remained the fulcrum of influence in Italy. Every decision made within its walls had ripple effects across the peninsula, reinforcing the Borgia's dominance and shaping the political landscape. In essence, the Vatican, under Alexander VI and Cesare Borgia, exemplified the fusion of sacred authority and secular power. It became a fortress not just of stone and guard posts, but of strategy, intelligence, and perception. Its strength lay as much in its psychological impact as in its physical defenses, creating an environment in which the Borgias could maneuver, intimidate, and consolidate power with unparalleled efficiency. As the papacy continued to exert influence over Italy and beyond, the Vatican stood as a symbol of Borgia ingenuity and ruthlessness. Its halls echoed with the whispers of conspiracy, the planning of campaigns, and the orchestration of alliances. From within this fortified seat, the Borgias demonstrated that power was not simply granted by position, but earned through vigilance, cunning, and a meticulous understanding of human ambition. The Vatican as a fortress became a template for how the interplay of fear, authority, and strategy could maintain dominance in a volatile political environment. It embodied the Borgia's understanding that influence was both a tangible and intangible force, requiring constant reinforcement and careful management. Through these walls, the Pope and his son shaped not only the politics of Rome, but the destiny of Italy itself, leaving a legacy that would be studied, feared, and mythologized for centuries. Chapter 13. The French storming the late 15th century. Italy was a land of divided states, each ruled by ambitious families and prone to shifting allegiances. Into this delicate balance arrived Charles VIII of France, a young monarch driven by dreams of conquest and claims to the Kingdom of Naples. His arrival would send tremors through the Italian peninsula, challenging the stability of the states and threatening the carefully constructed power networks of the Borgias. The French king's army, disciplined, well-equipped, and relentless, represented both a danger and an opportunity for Alexander VI and his son Cesare. The news of Charles VIII's campaign spread quickly through Rome, creating both panic and strategic urgency. Alexander VI understood that the papacy could not remain a passive observer. The presence of a foreign army near Italian territories demanded decisive action. Yet it also provided a chance to manipulate events to the Borgias' advantage, through a mixture of diplomacy, intelligence gathering, and the calculated use of alliances. Alexander and Cesare positioned themselves to influence the unfolding conflict. Cesare Borgia, ever the strategist, analyzed the movements of the French forces with precision. He recognized that the threat of invasion could be leveraged to strengthen the Borgias' position among other Italian states. Diplomatic envoys were dispatched to Milan, Florence, Venice, and Naples, each message crafted to maximize uncertainty and promote the Borgias' authority by exploiting the ambitions and fears of regional rulers. Cesare ensured that the French presence would not automatically translate into the weakening of Borgia power. The French storm, as contemporaries would call it, was more than a military threat. It was a psychological force. The mere sight of French banners marching across the plains of Italy inspired fear and prompted reconsideration of loyalties. The Borgias, however, were masters of perception. Alexander VI used his position to present the Vatican as both protector and arbiter, while Cesare coordinated responses that balanced resistance with accommodation. Their objective was clear: survive the storm while emerging with enhanced influence. Negotiations with Charles VIII became a delicate dance. The French king, seeking legitimacy and the expansion of his dominions, was open to persuasion. Caesar's envoys presented offers, subtly threatened potential allies, and highlighted the strategic advantages of cooperating with the Borgias. The negotiation was not simply about territory. It was about ensuring that the family remained central to the unfolding political landscape, influencing outcomes without exposing themselves to undue risk. The campaigns in Naples tested the limits of regional alliances. Local rulers, uncertain of French intentions, looked to the Borgias for guidance, protection, and mediation. Caesar's reputation as a decisive and ruthless leader enhanced the family's credibility. His ability to analyze situations, anticipate moves, and apply pressure when necessary allowed him to navigate the storm with remarkable skill. The interplay of diplomacy and military readiness ensured that the Borgias were not merely passive observers but active participants, shaping the trajectory of events. While Charles VIII advanced, the Italian states reacted with caution, uncertainty, and sometimes panic. Cesar capitalized on this fluidity, offering temporary truces, threatening intervention, and positioning Borgia forces strategically to control key locations. The use of spies and informants provided critical intelligence, allowing the Borgias to anticipate shifts in loyalty, exploit rivalries, and respond to emerging threats. In this environment, information was as valuable as soldiers, and Caesar's mastery of intelligence networks proved indispensable. Alexander V's role during the French storm was both spiritual and strategic. Public appearances, sermons, and correspondence emphasized his moral authority, while subtly reinforcing the temporal power of the papacy. The Pope projected calm and divine sanction, even as Rome prepared for the possibility of conflict. These actions bolstered the family's legitimacy, portraying the Borgias as protectors of Italy and as leaders capable of mediating between warring factions. The social and political atmosphere of Rome during this period was tense. Courtiers, nobles, and ambassadors moved cautiously, aware that every decision could shift the balance of power. Banquets and public ceremonies continued, but they carried an undercurrent of anxiety. Caesar's presence, commanding and observant, reminded all who entered the Vatican of the Borgia's capacity to influence outcomes, whether through diplomacy, intimidation, or force. The French storm also revealed vulnerabilities in regional powers. Florence, Milan, and Venice, while wealthy and influential, were fragmented internally, making them susceptible to manipulation. Caesar exploited these weaknesses, offering selective support, negotiating temporary alliances, and subtly undermining rival ambitions. His approach was neither reckless nor overtly confrontational. It relied on patience, observation, and the precise application of pressure at key moments. The interplay between diplomacy and warfare became a defining feature of this period. While French forces marched toward Naples, the Borgias maintained the flexibility to respond dynamically. Military contingents were positioned strategically to guard interests, while negotiators worked behind the scenes to mitigate potential losses and secure advantageous agreements. Caesar's ability to balance aggression with diplomacy exemplified the sophistication of Borgia strategy during times of crisis. Reports of skirmishes, defections, and political maneuvers flowed constantly into Rome. Alexander VI and Caesar analyzed these updates, recalibrating strategies and adjusting alliances accordingly. Every decision carried consequences: the potential to reinforce power, the risk of provoking hostility, or the opportunity to exploit rivals' In this high-stakes environment, the Borgias' vigilance, foresight, and decisiveness were critical to navigating the storm without succumbing to chaos. As the French threat progressed, the importance of perception became evident. Alexander VI's image as a mediator, protector, and legitimate ruler helped stabilize uncertain regions. Caesar's reputation for ruthless efficiency and strategic brilliance ensured that allies and rivals alike understood the consequences of disloyalty or misalignment. Together, father and son used the French storm not merely to survive, but to demonstrate the reach and effectiveness of Borgia influence. The outcome of this period was not a simple military victory or defeat. It was the consolidation of the Borgias' political position. By engaging with Charles VIII thoughtfully and strategically, the family managed to secure alliances, intimidate potential rivals, and maintain control over key territories. The storm that might have shattered other dynasties instead reinforced the Borgia's dominance, demonstrating their ability to adapt to crises and exploit opportunities in a fluid and dangerous political landscape. Ultimately, the French storm highlighted the interconnectedness of power, diplomacy, and perception in Renaissance Italy. The Borgia's response exemplified the combination of intelligence, strategy, and adaptability that defined their approach to governance and influence. Through careful orchestration, they navigated the threat of foreign invasion, strengthened their alliances, and cemented their reputation as a family capable of manipulating events and outcomes across the Italian peninsula. As Italy recovered from the tremors of the French incursion, the legacy of the storm remained. The Borgias emerged, not weakened, but more strategically positioned. Their web of alliances intact, their influence expanded, and their reputation for cunning and ruthlessness solidified. The French storm had tested the limits of their power, but in the end, it showcased the depth of their ambition, the precision of their strategy, and the enduring shadow they cast over Renaissance Italy. Chapter 14. Cesare, the tyrant Cesare Borgia, having abandoned his cardinalship to pursue power with the sword, transformed from a churchman into one of the most feared and enigmatic figures of the Italian Renaissance. With the backing of his father, Pope Alexander VI, he carved out a domain in central Italy, a patchwork of territories stitched together by ambition, intimidation, and calculated cruelty. Caesar's rise to power was swift, and his methods were ruthless, cementing his reputation as a tyrant whose influence extended far beyond the Vatican's walls. The Romagna region became the testing ground for Caesar's military genius. These city-states, each ruled by local lords with entrenched authority, presented both opportunities and obstacles. Caesar employed a strategy that combined force, diplomacy, and psychological warfare. He studied the strengths and weaknesses of each lord, identified internal divisions, and exploited rivalries to destabilize opposition before striking decisively. Armies loyal to him were deployed with precision, and any sign of resistance was met with swift punishment, often through executions or public displays of power designed to instill fear. Caesar's reputation as a tyrant was not born of whimsy. It was a deliberate tool of control. By establishing himself as an unpredictable and formidable force, he ensured that opposition often collapsed before any battle began. His combination of strategic foresight, charisma, and sheer brutality created an aura of invincibility. Towns that might have resisted submission often chose preemptive capitulation. Recognizing that Caesar's wrath was both inevitable and overwhelming, the consolidation of power in Romagna required more than military might. Cesare understood that political legitimacy was essential to maintain long-term control. He incorporated former adversaries into his administration, offering them positions and incentives to secure loyalty while simultaneously keeping them under close surveillance. This dual approach of coercion and co-optation allowed him to stabilize territories quickly and efficiently, transforming previously rebellious regions into extensions of Borgia authority. Caesar's use of intelligence networks further amplified his dominance. Spies and informants were strategically placed in towns, noble households, and even within his own ranks. Information was power, and Cesare wielded it masterfully, intercepting plots, manipulating perceptions, and ensuring that enemies were aware of his omnipresence. This surveillance created an environment where fear and uncertainty reinforced his control, as few dared to challenge a leader who seemed always to know their intentions before they were voiced beyond Romagna. Caesar's ambitions extended across the Italian peninsula. Alliances with France, Naples, Venice, and other city-states were leveraged to enhance his military campaigns and secure political advantages. Cesare understood that the appearance of strength and influence was as important as actual power. He carefully cultivated an image of authority, combining military successes with diplomatic maneuvering to present himself as both inevitable and indispensable in Italian politics. The nature of Caesar's tyranny was complex. While his rule was marked by fear and brutality, it also brought a degree of order and stability to regions previously mired in chaos. Roads were secured, tax systems enforced, and justice administered according to the new order he imposed. For some, his rule, though harsh, was preferable to the fragmented and capricious governance that preceded him. Caesar's capacity to merge terror with efficiency made him a uniquely effective ruler in an era defined by volatility. Caesar's personal charisma played a crucial role in his tyranny. He was a man who could inspire loyalty as easily as he inspired dread. His presence commanded attention, and his ability to read and manipulate people allowed him to convert potential rivals into allies, or at least neutralize threats before they could escalate. This combination of fear and admiration ensured that even those who despised his methods often deferred to his authority, recognizing the futility of resistance. The interplay between Caesar and his father, Pope Alexander VI, was central to the exercise of power. Alexander's position as pope provided Caesar with legitimacy, resources, and moral authority, while Caesar's conquests reinforced the temporal power of the papacy. This symbiotic relationship allowed the Borgias to extend their influence across Italy in ways that few families could match. The papal blessing served both as a shield against critics and a tool to intimidate adversaries, ensuring that Caesar's tyranny was sanctioned by divine authority. Caesar's approach to governance also involved calculated displays of cruelty. Public executions, punishments, and displays of force served as warnings to both citizens and rival lords. These spectacles were not arbitrary. They were deliberate, designed to communicate the consequences of defiance and the reach of Borgia power. The psychological impact of these measures reinforced obedience, as fear became a central instrument of governance. Despite his ruthless methods, Caesar's military campaigns were marked by strategic brilliance. He combined traditional tactics with innovative approaches, often outmaneuvering larger and better equipped forces through cunning, timing, and intelligence. His ability to anticipate opponents' moves and exploit weaknesses made him a formidable figure on the battlefield, further enhancing his reputation as a tyrant whose power was both real and perceived. Caesar's tyranny was also intertwined with the broader ambitions of the Borgia family. Every conquest, alliance, and political maneuver was designed to strengthen the family's position, ensuring that the papacy and its territories were under Borgia influence. The fusion of personal ambition with family strategy created a potent force, one that reshaped the political landscape of Italy and left a lasting imprint on the history of the Renaissance. However, the exercise of power was not without risk. Enemies multiplied, alliances shifted, and the constant use of fear as a tool of governance required perpetual vigilance. Caesar's genius lay in his ability to adapt, respond, and recalibrate strategies as circumstances evolved. His tyranny was not static. It was dynamic, evolving in response to challenges and opportunities, ensuring that the Borgias maintained their dominance. Even in the face of adversity, the legacy of Caesar's tyranny extended beyond the immediate territories he controlled. His campaigns, methods, and strategies influenced other rulers and were observed by contemporary thinkers, most notably Niccolò Machiavelli. Caesar's blend of fear, intelligence, and strategic calculation would later serve as a model for political theory, immortalizing his approach to power as both exemplary and cautionary. In Romania and beyond, Caesar's shadow loomed over Italy. His presence reshaped the political map, altered alliances, and instilled a pervasive sense of both dread and respect. The tyrant's rule was a study in the interplay of power, perception, and human psychology, demonstrating that authority was as much about controlling minds as it was about wielding armies. As the Italian state's grappled with Caesar's dominance, it became evident that his influence was not merely regional, but systemic. He had redefined the parameters of power, showing that a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and charisma could achieve what brute force alone could not. His methods, though brutal, brought a level of efficiency and order that reshaped central Italy and established the Borgia family as a dominant force in Renaissance politics. Cesare Borgia, the tyrant, was a man who embodied the contradictions of power, fear, and respect, brutality and strategy, ambition and loyalty. His rise demonstrated that true authority required more than military might. It demanded intelligence, perception, and the ability to manipulate the complex social and political currents of the time. In his hands, tyranny became an instrument of both consolidation and legacy. Securing the Borgia's place in the annals of history, the story of Caesar's tyranny is not merely one of conquests and cruelty. It is a testament to the art of power. Through strategy, intimidation, and keen political insight, he transformed the fortunes of his family and reshaped the Italian landscape. His rule, though feared and often reviled, illustrates the complexities of authority and the lengths to which a determined leader could go to achieve dominance. Cesare Borgia, the tyrant, remains an enduring figure of ambition, strategy, and the darker arts of Renaissance politics. Chapter 15. The Fall of Savonarola. The city of Florence, a jewel of the Renaissance, became a battleground not only for art and culture, but also for faith, morality, and political power. Within this vibrant city emerged Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar whose fiery sermons condemned the excesses of the church, including the opulence and corruption that had become synonymous with the papacy. Savonarola's voice resonated with the people, calling for moral reform and denouncing the sins of the clergy, and in particular, the scandalous behavior of Pope Alexander VI and the Borgia family. Savonarola's rise to prominence was meteoric. He attracted a devoted following in Florence, preaching against greed, corruption, and the moral decay that he claimed had overtaken both church and state. His sermons ignited a movement known as the Bonfire of the Vanities, where luxury goods, books, and art objects were publicly destroyed as symbols of vanity and moral corruption. In a city renowned for its wealth and artistic achievement, such actions shocked and captivated the populace, demonstrating Savonarola's extraordinary influence over public sentiment. The Borgia family, with Alexander VI at its helm, viewed Savonarola's rising power as a direct threat. His public denunciations undermined the legitimacy of the papacy and challenged the authority of the Pope, while also inspiring cities and rulers to question Borgia influence. The Vatican could not allow such defiance to go unchallenged, especially from a figure whose eloquence and fervor stirred both fear and admiration among Italians and beyond. Diplomacy and political maneuvering became the first line of response. Alexander VI sought to undermine Savonarola's credibility through papal censure, threats of excommunication, and leveraging loyal factions within Florence. Yet Savonarola's popularity among the common people and influential elites made direct confrontation perilous. Any overt attack risked inflaming his followers, potentially transforming a local moral crusade into a wider challenge to Borgia authority. Cesare Borgia's role in this struggle was one of calculated intimidation and strategic influence, while primarily focused on military conquests and territorial expansion. Cesare understood the importance of controlling narratives and neutralizing threats to papal authority. He ensured that Florence remained politically vulnerable, isolating Savonarola by cultivating alliances with rival factions within the city, thereby eroding the friars' support base without provoking direct confrontation. The struggle between Savonarola and the Borgias was as much psychological as it was political. Savonarola's sermons painted the Borgia family as corrupt and unholy, depicting their actions as the embodiment of moral decay. The Vatican, aware of the persuasive power of the friar, sought to counteract his influence through propaganda, emphasizing divine sanction for papal authority and the necessity of obedience. This clash of narratives turned Florence into a stage for a larger battle between moral authority and temporal power. With the populace caught in the tension, Savonarola's boldest challenge came in his direct condemnation of Alexander VI, whom he denounced as the Antichrist and a corrupter of the Church. Such accusations struck at the heart of Borgia power, undermining the Pope's credibility not only in Florence but potentially across Italy. For the Borgias, this was intolerable. The Pope and Cesare recognized that allowing Savonarola to continue unimpeded could inspire uprisings and embolden rivals. Threatening the delicate balance of power they had meticulously constructed, papal strategies escalated. Initially, Alexander VI excommunicated Savonarola, a measure intended to delegitimize the friar and warn his followers. However, the friar's charisma and the loyalty of the Florentine populace mitigated the impact of excommunication, turning it into a symbol of resistance rather than a deterrent. The Vatican realized that a more decisive intervention would be required to neutralize the threat. In Florence, political tensions heightened. Rival factions, previously suppressed by Savonarola's moral authority, found opportunities to act with Vatican support. The city became a crucible of conspiracy, negotiation, and betrayal, with Cesare and Alexander VI influencing events behind the scenes. The friar's enemies, emboldened by papal backing, worked tirelessly to undermine his power, while Savonarola sought to maintain control through sermons, public rituals, and appeals to civic pride. The culmination of this struggle was as dramatic as it was tragic. In 1498, Savonarola was arrested, tortured, and ultimately executed by hanging and burning. His death was both a spectacle and a warning, a demonstration of the consequences of challenging papal authority. The bonfire of the vanities and the fiery sermons that once captivated Florence became memories overshadowed by the harsh reality of political retribution. The execution not only silenced the friar, but reinforced the message that the Borgia papacy would not tolerate dissent. Consolidating their dominance through fear and demonstration of power, Savonarola's fall had immediate and long-term implications. In Florence, it marked the end of a period of intense moral and political activism, leaving the city more susceptible to external influence and internal control. For the Borgias, it was a strategic victory, eliminating a vocal critic and reaffirming the reach and authority of the papacy. The event also sent a clear message to other city-states and potential adversaries. Opposition to the Borgia family or the Pope would be met with swift and uncompromising action. However, Savonarola's legacy endured. The moral and religious questions he raised continued to resonate, inspiring reformist thought and influencing later movements within the Church and European society. His execution, while a triumph for the Borgias in the short term, also became a symbol of the tension between morality and power, faith and politics, a tension that would continue to define Renaissance Italy. The fall of Savonarola exemplifies the intersection of personal charisma, political influence, and the exercise of power in Renaissance Italy. It demonstrates how the Borgias, despite their scandals and notoriety, effectively employed a combination of intelligence, alliances, and intimidation to maintain control. Caesar's role, though primarily military and strategic, contributed to the orchestration of the events, highlighting the family's ability to manage both spiritual authority and temporal governance. Ultimately, the execution of Savonarola reinforced the image of the Borgias as a family capable of wielding power decisively and ruthlessly. It underscored the importance of perception, control, and strategic calculation in maintaining dominance over Italian politics. The fall of Florence's fiery preacher became a chapter in the larger narrative of Borgia ambition, illustrating the lengths to which the family would go to secure their legacy and maintain authority over both spiritual and temporal realms. The interplay of fear, influence, and morality in this episode provides insight into the broader strategies employed by the Borgias. They understood that power was not merely a function of wealth or title, but also of perception, control of narratives, and the elimination of threats. The fate of Savonarola exemplifies the calculated precision with which the Borgias operated, blending diplomacy, intimidation, and ruthless action to maintain their dominance. In conclusion, the fall of Savonarola is a testament to the Borgia family's strategic acumen and unyielding pursuit of power. The execution of a charismatic and popular opponent sent a message across Italy, the papacy under Alexander VI, with Caesar as his instrument, would tolerate no challenges to its authority. Savonarola's death, though a moral tragedy, solidified the Borgia image as a family whose ambition, cunning, and ruthlessness reshaped the political and spiritual landscape of Renaissance Italy, leaving a legacy both feared and remembered for centuries. Chapter 17. The Banquet of Blood. Rome, in the height of the Renaissance, was a city of opulence, intrigue, and power plays, and at the center of this swirl of political and social complexity was the Borgia family. Pope Alexander VI's court was known for its splendor, yet behind the lavish banquets and glittering celebrations lay a world of treachery and manipulation. Among the most infamous tales that circulated through the city was the so-called Banquet of the Chestnuts, an event shrouded in rumor and scandal, where the line between revelry and horror blurred, and where the Borgia's reputation for cunning, cruelty, and decadence was cemented in legend. The banquet itself was said to have been hosted in the Vatican, a palace that now served as both the spiritual heart of the Catholic Church and a center of temporal power. The setting was extravagant. Chandeliers glimmered with candlelight, the tables were laden with exotic foods, and musicians filled the air with melodies that seemed to mask the sinister undertones of the gathering. Nobles, clergy, and diplomats attended, drawn by the allure of proximity to the Pope and the power that accompanied his favor. The atmosphere was one of anticipation, yet underlying the grandeur was an unmistakable tension, a sense that nothing at the Borgia court was ever quite as it appeared. Whispers of the night's events spoke of shocking behavior, sexual debauchery, the alleged involvement of poison, and the manipulation of the city's elite to demonstrate the Borgia's dominance. Cesare Borgia, ever the strategist, was said to have observed and influenced proceedings, ensuring that the spectacle reinforced both fear and fascination among attendees. The purpose of such displays was not merely indulgence, but a calculated assertion of power, an unmistakable message that the Borgia family controlled the levers of influence and that transgression would carry consequences. While the veracity of the tales is debated, the narrative served a strategic purpose. Reports of the banquet spread rapidly through Rome and beyond, creating an aura of both horror and awe. Allies were intimidated, rivals warned, and the public fascinated. Whether the events occurred exactly as described or were exaggerated by enemies of the Borgias, the story functioned as a psychological weapon, amplifying the family's reputation for ruthlessness and cunning. In Renaissance Italy, perception was power, and the Banquet of Blood exemplified the mastery with which the Borgias managed both. The political ramifications of the banquet were equally significant. The gathering allowed the Borgias to consolidate alliances, assess loyalties, and exert subtle pressure on influential figures. Nobles and clerics, while outwardly compliant, understood that participation in Borgia ceremonies carried both privilege and peril. Observing how individuals behaved under scrutiny allowed Cesare to identify potential threats, allies, and manipulable personalities, turning what appeared to be a social event into an instrument of governance. Behind closed doors, Cesare also used the occasion to discuss military strategy, political deals, and alliances. leveraging the gathering's social aspects to advance family objectives. In this way, the lines between pleasure, power, and manipulation blurred seamlessly. Every action, gesture, and conversation was part of a larger chessboard, where influence was the ultimate currency, and the stakes were nothing less than the survival and expansion of Borgia dominance. The banquet's infamous reputation also served to isolate potential adversaries, by fostering an environment in which excess, fear, and spectacle dominated. The Borgias discouraged conspiracies and dissent. Those who might have considered plotting against the family were forced to weigh the consequences, realizing that their every move could be observed and manipulated. The shadows cast by the events of that night extended far beyond the palace walls, reinforcing the sense that the Borgias were omnipresent and omnipotent. Rome's populace, ever attentive to the movements of the papal court, absorbed the stories with a mixture of fascination and terror. The city's cultural and political fabric was interwoven with rumors, gossip, and tales that both reflected and amplified the power dynamics at play. The Banquet of Blood became part of a narrative that positioned the Borgias as both extraordinary and morally transgressive, a duality that would define their enduring legacy in history. The psychological impact on both allies and adversaries cannot be understated. By intertwining spectacle with subtle coercion, the Borgias ensured that loyalty was maintained, obedience reinforced, and fear strategically applied. Caesar's presence at the banquet, coupled with Alexander VI's authority, demonstrated a seamless fusion of charisma and intimidation, creating an environment in which the family's influence was omnipresent and unquestionable. While historians continued to debate the exact details, the Banquet of Blood represents a symbolic moment in the Borgia narrative, illustrating the interplay of power, perception, and manipulation. It highlights how social rituals, when orchestrated with strategic intent, can serve as tools of governance and psychological control. The event's legacy endures, serving as a lens through which to examine the Borgia family's mastery of influence and the darker aspects of Renaissance politics. The night also reinforced internal family dynamics. Caesar's role, particularly, exemplified the combination of strategic intellect and ruthless execution. His ability to navigate the complexities of high society, military ambition, and political intrigue during such events allowed him to consolidate authority while reinforcing the image of the Borgias as a family beyond ordinary morality. The banquet, whether fully true or embellished, was a stage for demonstrating power, shaping perception, and controlling narratives. The Banquet of Blood, as a legend, also served as a cautionary tale for other rulers and families. It demonstrated the effectiveness of spectacle in reinforcing dominance, the psychological leverage of fear, and the strategic value of controlling information and narrative. The Borgias, through calculated orchestration, managed to convert a single night into a lasting emblem of their power, cruelty, and influence. Ultimately, the Banquet of Blood exemplifies the Borgia approach to authority, a synthesis of diplomacy, intimidation, spectacle, and subtle coercion. Every guest, every story, and every rumor was a tool in the broader strategy of dominance. The events of that night, whether fully factual or encapsulate the family's mastery over perception and power, solidifying their place as both infamous and formidable actors in Renaissance Italy. Through the lens of this infamous banquet, the Borgia's reign becomes a study in the orchestration of fear, loyalty, and spectacle. The blending of social ritual with strategic intent highlights the family's understanding of human behavior, manipulation, and control. In the annals of history, the Banquet of Blood remains a vivid illustration of the ways in which power, perception, and narrative intertwine, offering a chilling glimpse into the mind and methods of one of the most notorious dynasties of the Renaissance. Chapter 16. Shadows of Betrayal. The Borgia dynasty, at the height of its power, was both feared and envied across Italy. Yet, The greater the height, the sharper the fall. Within the Vatican and across their territories, the shadows of betrayal began to form as allies, rivals, and even members of the Borgia family navigated a delicate balance between loyalty and ambition. Caesar, having established his dominion in Rumonia and secured the influence of his father, knew that survival depended not only on conquest but on anticipating treachery at every turn. Rome itself was a city teeming with conspiracies. Nobles sought favor with the Pope while plotting for personal gain. Mercenary captains, initially allies, weighed their loyalties against the lure of wealth or advantage from rival powers. Even within the Vatican, whispers of dissent circulated, hinting at plots that could destabilize Alexander VI's authority and endanger Caesar's carefully constructed empire. In such a climate, the line between friend and foe was perilously thin. Caesar's keen intelligence network became indispensable. Informants were embedded within the homes of nobles, the streets of Rome, and the courts of neighboring states. Every piece of information was scrutinized, every rumor investigated. Knowledge of betrayal before it could unfold was as valuable as any army, and Caesar wielded it with the precision of a master strategist. This constant vigilance, though exhausting, was essential to maintain control and preempt plots that could threaten the family's grip on power. Tensions within the Borgia family added another layer of complexity. While Alexander VI wielded the papacy with calculated authority, Caesar's growing independence and ambition sometimes alarmed his father and those closest to the Pope. Juan's untimely death had left a power vacuum that Caesar now filled, but whispers suggested that envy and distrust could still fester, both inside and outside the family. Caesar's challenge was to navigate these internal tensions while projecting unwavering strength to the outside world. Alliances with external powers were equally precarious. The French, Venetians, and Neapolitans, each seeking advantage in the Italian political landscape, viewed the Borgias with a mix of fear and opportunism. Negotiations were constant, and any lapse in vigilance could be exploited. Caesar understood that betrayal often came not as open rebellion, but in subtle shifts of loyalty, secret correspondence, or promises made behind closed doors. Anticipating such moves required both intellect and intuition. The art of political deception became a cornerstone of Borgia strategy. Caesar cultivated appearances of trust while setting traps for potential betrayers. Courtiers were rewarded for loyalty but reminded that disloyalty would not go unpunished. Foreign envoys were courted and observed, their statements and behavior dissected for hidden intentions. Every social interaction, banquet, and audience was a test of allegiance, revealing those who could be trusted and those whose ambitions might lead them to betrayal. One of the most dangerous threats came from the very alliances that had once seemed secure. Noble families, whose power was curtailed by Caesar's rise, harbored resentment. The Medici, Sforza, and other dynasties watched for any sign of weakness in the Borgia's armor. Even within the church, cardinals and bishops wary of Alexander VI's corruption plotted subtle maneuvers to limit the Pope's influence. Caesar's ability to detect, neutralize, or manipulate these plots determined the stability of Borgia authority. Assassination, while never confirmed, remained an ever-present fear. Rumors of poisoned goblets, ambushed messengers, and sudden deaths circulated in the streets of Rome, whether based on truth or political fiction. The perception of danger served Caesar's purposes. It reinforced obedience and caution, keeping both allies and adversaries vigilant and submissive. The shadows themselves became tools, shaping behavior and manipulating the ambitions of those who sought power. The Vatican's walls, already fortified against external threats, now functioned as a psychological bastion against betrayal. Secret passages, controlled access, and carefully managed audiences allowed the Borgias to monitor and influence those within. Trust was a rare commodity, carefully rationed, and loyalty was constantly tested. Caesar's management of internal and external threats became an art form, balancing punishment, reward, and intimidation to maintain dominance. Caesar's campaigns in Romania also reflected the influence of betrayal. Towns and lords, who seemed compliant, were observed for signs of discontent. Military movements were calculated to demonstrate strength without provoking unnecessary rebellion. When betrayal was detected, swift and public punishment reinforced the consequences of disloyalty. The message was clear. Power was maintained not only through conquest, but through the management of fear, perception, and trust. Even among allies, subtle manipulation was necessary. Caesar encouraged rivalries, exploited ambitions, and orchestrated situations where loyalty could be tested and reaffirmed. By controlling both opportunity and consequence, he ensured that loyalty remained a product of both fear and strategic advantage. Betrayal, when it occurred, was rarely spontaneous. It was a calculated gamble that often ended in failure. The shadows of betrayal extended to diplomacy. Caesar and Alexander VI engaged in negotiations with foreign rulers, while simultaneously preparing for treachery. Treaties were scrutinized for hidden clauses, promises were verified through intelligence, and envoys were observed for deviation from official positions. The interplay of trust and suspicion defined every diplomatic exchange, reflecting the delicate balance required to navigate Italian politics. Within Rome, the streets themselves became a stage for intrigue. Messages were intercepted, allegiances tested, and public appearances choreographed to reinforce Borgia authority. Every interaction was an opportunity to assess loyalty, gather intelligence, or subtly intimidate potential adversaries. Caesar's mastery of observation and manipulation ensured that betrayal could be detected, managed, and, when necessary, punished before it could escalate into full-scale rebellion. The personal cost of constant vigilance was immense. Cesare and Alexander VI lived under the weight of perpetual suspicion, aware that any lapse could be fatal. Their success depended on an acute understanding of human ambition and fear, coupled with the ability to act decisively when necessary. The shadows of betrayal were not merely external threats. They were a constant companion, shaping decisions, strategies, and the very structure of Borgia power. Despite the ever-present danger, the Borgias maintained their dominance. Through a combination of intelligence, strategic alliances, psychological manipulation, and calculated displays of power, they navigated the treacherous waters of Renaissance politics. Betrayal was anticipated, and control was asserted with precision, demonstrating the effectiveness of a family that understood the complexities of power, loyalty, and ambition. The lessons of the shadows of betrayal extended beyond immediate political survival. Caesar's methods became a model for understanding the exercise of power. Loyalty must be monitored, ambition must be anticipated, and perception must be managed. The Borgias' ability to operate effectively amidst constant threat ensured that their empire, though fraught with danger, remained formidable, feared, and respected as plots unfolded and were neutralized. The Borgia family reinforced their reputation as masters of intrigue. Rome, the Vatican, and the Italian states watched as Caesar navigated treachery with skill and ruthlessness. Every whisper of conspiracy, every detected betrayal, became an opportunity to consolidate authority and project the enduring strength of the family. In the end, the shadows of betrayal were both a threat and a tool. Caesar and Alexander VI understood that the constant presence of potential treachery could be harnessed to reinforce discipline, loyalty, and obedience by managing fear, intelligence, and perception. The Borgias maintained their dominance and demonstrated that the true art of power lay not only in conquest and wealth, but in the subtle orchestration of human ambition and suspicion. The shadows of betrayal, ever present and unseen, became an essential element of Borgia rule, a silent testament to their cunning, strategy, and enduring influence in Renaissance Italy. Chapter 18. The death of Alexander Vitha, year 1503, marked a turning point for the Borgia family, as the towering figure of Pope Alexander VI faced the inevitability that all mortal rulers do, death. Though his life had been defined by ambition, cunning, and the relentless pursuit of power, even Alexander VI could not escape the inescapable toll of age and disease. The Vatican, long a stage for both splendor and intrigue, now became a crucible of uncertainty as the papacy faced a moment that would determine the fate of the Borgia dynasty. Alexander's health had been in decline for months, weakened by years of indulgence, stress, and the constant demands of maintaining authority in a city rife with rivalries and plots. Yet, even as his body failed, the Pope remained alert to the political currents swirling around him. Advisors, allies, and enemies watched closely, knowing that the papal death would unleash a wave of maneuvering, both for succession and for the future of territories and influence tightly controlled by the Borgia family. Rumors abounded regarding the circumstances of his death. Some whispered of fever and illness, a natural culmination of a life filled with excess and exposure. Others speculated more sinisterly that poison, administered by jealous rivals or even discontented members of the Church, had accelerated the Pope's demise. The truth remains shrouded in history's shadows, a testament to the uncertainty and intrigue that had defined the Borgia era. What is certain, however, is that Alexander VI's death sent shockwaves through Rome, Italy, and the wider Catholic world. The immediate aftermath of the Pope's death revealed the fragility and volatility of the Borgia power structure. Cesare, who had relied on his father's authority for legitimacy, found himself navigating a suddenly uncertain political landscape. Without Alexander as papal imprimatur, the territories Caesare had carved in Romania and beyond were vulnerable. Allies previously compliant under the papal shadow began to reassess loyalties, weighing the potential benefits of shifting allegiance against the risks of Borgia retaliation. Political maneuvering intensified within the Vatican. Cardinals and powerful clerics, many of whom had tolerated Alexander VI's excesses out of fear or pragmatism, now began jockeying for influence in the forthcoming papal conclave. The death of a pope had always been a catalyst for power struggles, but the vacuum left by Alexander VI was particularly pronounced given the notoriety and consolidation of the Borgia family. Caesar's acumen as a strategist was immediately tested, as he sought to protect the family's interests while facing the reality of diminished authority. The death also had profound psychological effects on Rome itself. Citizens and courtiers who had lived under the shadow of the Borgia family for decades were confronted with uncertainty. Public displays of mourning were both genuine and performative, reflecting respect for the office of the papacy, while simultaneously allowing observers to gauge the mood and intentions of those in power. The tension in the city was palpable, as everyone understood that the transition of power would bring both opportunity and danger. For the Borgias, the legacy of Alexander VI was a double-edged sword. On one hand, the Pope's reign had secured immense wealth, influence, and territorial control for the family. On the other, his notoriety, combined with the accumulation of enemies, meant that his death exposed vulnerabilities that had been carefully masked during his lifetime. Caesar's challenge was to navigate these vulnerabilities while maintaining the appearance of authority and inevitability. Caesar's response to the crisis reflected both his ruthlessness and strategic brilliance. He moved quickly to consolidate control over Romania, reinforcing loyalty through both reward and intimidation. Local lords were reminded of the consequences of defiance, while allies were reassured of the continued influence of the Borgia family. By acting decisively, Cesare minimized the risk of fragmentation and ensured that the territories he had fought to control remained under his dominion, even in the absence of papal support beyond Italy. The death of Alexander VI sent reverberations through Europe. Monarchs, diplomats, and religious leaders assessed the implications of the Pope's passing, calculating how the shift in power might affect alliances, trade, and political influence. The Borgia name, once a source of fear and manipulation, was now tested by the uncertainty of succession, revealing both the resilience and fragility of the family's network of power. The manner of Alexander's death, whether by natural causes or foul play, became a focal point for speculation, further cementing the aura of intrigue surrounding the Borgias. Rumors proliferated, each story reflecting the enduring fascination with a family whose life and rule had blurred the line between reality and legend. The Pope's passing underscored the precarious balance of authority, the ever-present threat of betrayal, and the ways in which perception could shape history. Alexander V's death also prompted reflection on his accomplishments and failures. He had elevated the Borgia family to unprecedented heights, consolidated power through cunning diplomacy, and wielded both spiritual and temporal authority with skill and audacity. Yet, his excesses, scandals, and controversial actions had created enemies, damaged the moral credibility of the papacy, and left a legacy of suspicion and legend. His passing marked the end of an era, leaving behind both the fruits and the dangers of ambition, untempered by restraint. For Caesar, the death of his father represented both a challenge and an opportunity. Freed from Alexander's direct influence, he had the chance to assert his authority more independently. However, without the papal shield, he also faced increased threats from rivals, rebellious lords, and foreign powers eager to exploit the transitional period. Caesar's ability to navigate this volatile landscape would determine not only his personal fortunes, but also the continuation of the Borgia legacy. The transition period following Alexander VI's death was characterized by both mourning and calculated political maneuvering. Caesar, aware of the fragility of his position, employed a combination of displays of loyalty, strategic alliances, and controlled intimidation to stabilize the family's influence. The delicate balance of power required constant vigilance, and every interaction, decision, and communication carried weighty consequences for the future of the Borgias. Ultimately, the death of Alexander VI was more than the passing of a pope. It was a seismic event that reshaped the political and social landscape of Renaissance Italy. It tested the resilience of the Borgia family, challenged the authority of their influence, and exposed the fragility of power built on both fear and perception. Caesar's response, his ability to maintain control, and his navigation of the ensuing chaos would define the final chapter of the family's dominance and the enduring legend of the Borgia. In the shadow of Alexander VI's death, the city of Rome and the broader Italian peninsula entered a period of uncertainty and realignment. Loyalties shifted, conspiracies emerged, and the vacuum of power created opportunities for both ambition and treachery. The Borgia family, once seemingly invincible, now faced the ultimate test. Could they survive without the guiding hand of their patriarch? Or would the shadows of enemies long waiting for their chance finally descend upon them? The death of Alexander VI thus marked not only an end, but a beginning, the twilight of a papacy characterized by audacity, scandal, and brilliance, and the dawn of a final, decisive chapter in the saga of Cesare Borgia. History would remember Alexander VI for his brilliance and his excess, for his cunning and his corruption, and for the indelible mark he left upon the Church, the city of Rome, and the turbulent landscape of Renaissance Italy. Chapter 19. Caesar's Last Stand. The death of Pope Alexander VI left Cesare Borgia in a precarious position. With the papal shield gone, Caesar's carefully constructed power network across Italy became vulnerable. Territories he had won in Romania, cities under his influence, and alliances he had forged for decades were now at risk. Rivals sensed weakness, and political opportunists saw a chance to reclaim lost ground. Caesar faced the ultimate test of leadership, the point at which ambition, strategy, and ruthlessness would be measured against the unyielding reality of a changing political landscape. Caesar's first challenge was Rome. Without Alexander VI, the city was no longer a secure base. Cardinals and influential families, many of whom had been subdued by the Pope's authority, began maneuvering for influence in the forthcoming conclave. Caesar needed to maintain a delicate balance, showing strength without alienating potential allies. Every decision had to be calculated, every display of power carefully measured, as missteps could result in the rapid collapse of Borgia authority. In Romania, Caesar's military campaigns had created both fear and respect. Local lords and governors had been crushed, intimidated, or coerced into loyalty. Yet, the absence of papal backing left them questioning their allegiance. Cesare responded swiftly, employing a combination of military might and strategic diplomacy to maintain control. He reminded his subjects of the consequences of defiance, while offering rewards to those who demonstrated loyalty. His actions reflected the duality of Borgia governance: fear and favor, punishment and reward, intertwined to maintain dominance. Meanwhile, external threats loomed large. The Kingdom of Naples, the Duchy of Milan, and even France observed Caesar's vulnerability, weighing opportunities to expand their own influence in Italian affairs. Cesare, ever aware of the geopolitical stakes, sought alliances where possible and prepared defenses where necessary. His movements were rapid, deliberate, and often ruthless, reflecting the lessons he had learned under his father's guidance and the practical necessities of survival in a fractious Italy. Betrayal became an immediate concern. Former allies, sensing weakness, attempted to undermine Caesar's authority. Some plotted openly, while others maneuvered subtly behind the scenes. Caesar's intelligence network, which had been instrumental in maintaining power during Alexander VI's reign, was now tested under heightened pressure. Spies, informants, and loyalists were deployed strategically, uncovering conspiracies before they could take root. The shadows of treachery were omnipresent, and Caesar's survival depended on anticipating and neutralizing every threat. One of the most critical tests was the shifting loyalties of mercenary forces and condottieri who had fought under Caesar's command. These men, motivated by both payment and ambition, were prone to changing sides if they sensed weakness. Caesar acted decisively, rewarding those who remained loyal and punishing those who wavered. His reputation for cruelty and precision in enforcing discipline became a tool of deterrence, ensuring that even the most opportunistic soldiers considered carefully before betraying him. The political landscape within the Vatican remained volatile. The papal conclave following Alexander VI's death opened the door to new power struggles. Cardinals, seeking to shape the election and influence the future direction of the Church, were potential allies and threats. Cesare attempted to sway the conclave through both diplomacy and intimidation, demonstrating that, though his father was gone, the Borgia presence was still formidable. Yet, even his considerable influence had limits, and Caesar recognized that the papacy itself could now function as a force, independent of Borgia control. Caesar's personal ambitions were also tested. The dream of a hereditary Borgia dominion across central Italy faced the stark reality of political fragmentation. Enemies were numerous, and the complex web of alliances that had secured Borgia dominance was unraveling. Cesare relied on his military acumen, charisma, and strategic mind to delay the inevitable. But the forces arrayed against him were relentless, and fortune, as ever, was unpredictable. In a series of engagements across Rome, Caesar sought to consolidate territories and eliminate threats. Battles were brutal, calculated, and often decisive. Yet, for every victory, new challenges arose. Rival lords, emboldened by the papal vacancy, attempted to reclaim lost lands. Local uprisings, while small in scale, threatened to inspire broader resistance. Caesar's response combined ruthless suppression with tactical alliances, reflecting the complex interplay of fear and negotiation that had defined Borgia power. Despite his strategic brilliance, Cesare could not fully contain the forces arrayed against him. Gradually, betrayals, shifting loyalties, and external pressures began to erode his holdings. Cities that once bent to his will became difficult to govern, and the carefully orchestrated balance of fear and favor started to collapse. The vacuum left by Alexander's death exposed vulnerabilities that even Caesar's genius could not entirely overcome. Ultimately, Caesar's last stand was a testament to both his brilliance and the limits of power. Surrounded by enemies, betrayed by former allies, and facing the inexorable tide of political change, he fought to maintain authority to the end. His campaigns, both military and diplomatic, became increasingly desperate, each action a bid to preserve the remnants of the Borgia Empire. The shadow of inevitability loomed large, and Caesar's brilliance alone could not prevent the final unraveling of the dynasty. Captured and imprisoned by rival forces, Caesar's dream of a Borgia dominion disintegrated. The territories he had carved through strategy and bloodshed were quickly reabsorbed by competing powers. Allies who had once feared him now distanced themselves, ensuring survival by abandoning loyalty to a fallen prince. Caesar's reputation, forged through years of cunning, ambition, and ruthlessness, became a symbol of both fear and caution, a cautionary tale of power's fragility when dependent on perception and the delicate balance of influence. Caesar's final days were marked by reflection and the inescapable weight of failure. The vision of a Borgia dynasty, spanning central Italy, nurtured by his father and executed through his own ambition, lay in ruins. Political enemies had succeeded where strategy, intimidation, and martial skill could not, demonstrating the complex interplay of chance, human ambition, and the limitations of even the most formidable genius. The end of Caesar's power marked the conclusion of the Borgia family's dominance in Italy. Territories reclaimed, alliances broken, and influence diminished. The family's extraordinary ascent had come full circle, from the pinnacle of papal authority and territorial control. The Borgias were reduced to historical memory, their legacy defined by both brilliance and infamy. Caesar's last stand, though ultimately unsuccessful, remains a testament to his extraordinary talent, ambition, and the ruthless precision with which he sought to shape the world around him. In the annals of history, Cesare Borgia's final struggle illustrates the perils of power, untempered by enduring institutional support. His tactical genius and political acumen were formidable, yet even these could not overcome the vulnerabilities exposed by the death of Alexander VI. The Borgia saga, culminating in Caesar's last stand, serves as a vivid reminder that the exercise of power, no matter how calculated, is always subject to the forces of chance, loyalty, and human ambition. Caesar's downfall also underscores the transient nature of fear-based authority. The same strategies that secured compliance and AW during his rise became insufficient once the foundation of papal authority was removed. The delicate interplay of charisma, intimidation, and strategic alliances that had enabled Borgia dominance illustrates a timeless lesson. Power must be constantly maintained, and the loss of a central pillar can precipitate rapid collapse. Ultimately, Caesar's last stand was more than a personal defeat. It was the conclusion of an era. The extraordinary Borgia experiment, with its fusion of ambition, cunning, and audacious strategy, came to an end. Yet, the legend endured, immortalized in tales of intrigue, in the writings of contemporaries, and in the historical record. Caesar's campaigns, battles, and political maneuvers continue to captivate, offering insight into the nature of power, loyalty, and the human desire to shape destiny in the volatile world of Renaissance Italy. Chapter 20. Legacy of Shadows. The Borgia dynasty, having risen to extraordinary heights of power, influence, and notoriety, ultimately fell into history as a symbol of both brilliance and infamy. With the deaths of Pope Alexander VI and the downfall of Cesare Borgia, the family's dominion over Rome and central Italy was dismantled. Territories were reclaimed by rival states, allies distanced themselves, and the once feared presence of the Borgias faded from political reality. Yet, despite their collapse, the shadows they cast endured, lingering in legend, rumor, and the very fabric of Renaissance memory. The legacy of the Borgias is one of duality. They were both architects of extraordinary power and victims of human ambition's fragility. Alexander VI's papacy had transformed the family from regional nobility into players on the grand stage of European politics. Through cunning, bribery, and strategic marriages, he consolidated influence in the Vatican and beyond. Cesare, armed with military prowess and political acumen, sought to transform that influence into territorial dominance. Together, father and son created a dynasty that was both admired and feared, celebrated and vilified. Yet, the world they shaped was unstable, reflecting the precarious nature of power built on personal dominance rather than institutional legitimacy. Their rise was meteoric, but so too was their fall, highlighting a timeless truth: influence, sustained by fear and manipulation, is inherently vulnerable. The alliances that had been carefully cultivated unraveled in the absence of Alexander's authority, demonstrating the limits of even the most calculated strategy when the foundation of power is removed. In the centuries that followed, the Borgia family became the subject of fascination, scandal, and moral reflection. Writers, historians, and artists portrayed them in both historical accounts and fictionalized narratives, amplifying tales of intrigue, corruption, and excess. The stories of the banquet of blood, the mysterious deaths of rivals, and the ruthless campaigns of Cesare Borgia became part of the collective imagination, blurring the line between reality and legend. Their name became synonymous with cunning, ambition, and the darker aspects of human desire for power. The Borgias' influence on Renaissance Italy extended beyond mere territorial control. They exemplified the ways in which the papacy could be wielded as both spiritual authority and temporal power. Their actions highlighted the moral complexities of leadership, the interplay between ambition and ethics, and the capacity of individuals to shape history in profound ways. The lessons of their successes and failures continue to resonate, offering insight into the mechanics of power, loyalty, and the human condition. Despite their notoriety, the Borgias were not merely villains of history. Their achievements reflected intelligence, strategic planning, and a keen understanding of human behavior. Alexander VI's diplomatic skills, Caesar's military brilliance, and the family's manipulation of alliances were formidable and, in many ways, ahead of their time. They operated in a world where politics, religion, and personal ambition were inseparable, and their ability to navigate that world speaks to their extraordinary capabilities. Lucretia Borgia's life, intertwined with the family's fortunes, reflects the personal dimension of this legacy, often portrayed as a pawn or a figure of scandal. She also wielded influence through marriages, diplomacy, and subtle manipulation. Her story illustrates the complexity of female agency within a patriarchal society, and the ways in which individual action intersected with family strategy. Lucretia's legend, like that of her father and brother, is a mixture of fact, rumor, and interpretation, highlighting the enduring fascination with the Borgia narrative. The myths surrounding the Borgias also served political purposes. Rivals and chroniclers, seeking to discredit the family, amplified tales of corruption, poisonings, and immorality. These narratives, while not entirely reliable, contributed to the lasting image of the Borgias as archetypes of ambition unrestrained by morality. The interplay between historical reality and propagandistic storytelling ensured that the family's reputation would persist long after their political power had dissipated. The Borgia papacy also had broader implications for the Catholic Church. The excesses and scandals associated with Alexander VI contributed to debates about reform, the nature of spiritual authority, and the role of morality in governance. The family's actions prompted reflection on the responsibilities of religious leadership and the consequences of combining ecclesiastical office with personal ambition. In this sense, the Borgia legacy is both a cautionary tale and a study in the complexities of human governance. Cesare Borgia's influence on political theory further cemented the family's historical significance. His actions, military campaigns, and strategic use of power fascinated thinkers such as Niccolò Machiavelli, who cited Cesare as a model of the effective, if ruthless, prince. Through Machiavelli's writings, Caesare's tactics and decisions transcended the immediacy of Renaissance Italy, influencing political thought for generations and embedding the Borgia name in intellectual history. The collapse of Borgia power did not erase their cultural or psychological impact. Across Italy and Europe, their story became a lens through which to examine the exercise of power, the intersection of ambition and morality, and the human capacity for both greatness and excess. Artists, writers, and historians drew inspiration from the family's dramatic rise and fall, ensuring that the Borghese remained a subject of fascination in art, literature, and popular imagination. In conclusion, the legacy of the Borgia family is a tapestry of ambition, strategy, brilliance, and scandal. Their achievements, though monumental, were inseparable from the controversies and moral ambiguities that accompanied them. The shadows they cast, both literal and figurative, continue to inform our understanding of power, human behavior, and the history of the Renaissance. They are remembered not merely for their excesses or crimes, but for the extraordinary combination of intellect, cunning, and audacity that defined their era. The Borgia story reminds us that history is shaped by individuals whose ambitions, virtues, and vices intersect with the broader currents of politics and society. Alexander VI, Caesar, and Lucretia, through their triumphs and failures, illustrate the delicate balance between genius and folly, authority and vulnerability, perception and reality. Their legacy endures, a shadow across time, illuminating the complexities of power and the enduring fascination with the most notorious family in Renaissance Italy.